At this time, the court calls State of Wisconsin v. Stephen Avery, case number 05CF381. We're here this morning for a continuation of a trial in this matter. Will the parties again state their appearances for the record?
Good morning, Your Honor. May it please the court, the state appears by Assistant Attorney General Tom Fallon, District Attorney Ken Kratz, and in a very short moment, Assistant District Attorney Norm Gahn on behalf of the state.
Good morning, Your Honor. Attorneys Jerome Buting and Dean Strang appearing with Mr. Avery.
Very well. The defense may call its witness at this time.
Okay. The defense calls JANINE ARVIZU.
Please state your right hand. Please be seated. Please state.
Could we have just one moment for Mr. Gahn? This will be his witness. He apparently is momentarily delayed.
It will just be a moment, Judge. He's carrying some things in.
All right. I will allow the clerk to swear the witness, and then we'll wait for the examination till Mr. Gahn gets here.
Thank you.
Please state your name, spell your last name for the record.
My name is JANINE ARVIZU, ARVIZU.
This microphone has been a little bit touchy the whole time, so we'll try it right about there.
Okay, thank you.
I'm so sorry, Your Honor. I was held up on something. I apologize to the court.
All right, Mr. Buting, you may begin.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. ARVIZU, would you tell us your occupation, please?
Yes, I'm a laboratory quality auditor.
Okay. And how are you employed?
I do independent contracting for people who use analytical data and want to understand how reliable, and how valid the data are.
Okay. And before I get into that a little bit more, would you tell me first what your educational background is?
Yes, sir. I have a Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and ABD in Chemistry from the University of New Mexico, and I'm certified as a quality auditor by the American Society for Quality.
Okay. And what is an ABD?
ABD is all but dissertation. It's essentially that you've completed the course and work examinations for the PhD, but did not complete the dissertation.
Okay. Maybe just explain to us why you got to that point and then didn't complete your PhD.
I accepted employment with one of the DOE, Department of Energy National Laboratories, to continue the work I was doing my dissertation on. That was funded by the Department of Energy. After I accepted employment and started working, we lost funding for that project. So I elected to keep the job rather than to go back to school.
Okay. And do you have what is the exhibit number in front of you?
499.
499. Can you just identify that for the record?
It's a copy of my resume.
Okay. And does that summarize your educational background as well as your areas of expertise and professional experience?
Yes.
All right. We'll talk a little bit about your professional experience in a minute, but first, the chemistry that you are involved with, is that analytical chemistry?
Yes.
And what is a lab auditor and who uses them?
A lab auditor is pretty much similar to what you would expect for an auditor of any other discipline. Lab auditors go into the laboratories and essentially look at how reliable and how valid the data are that are reported by a laboratory. The people who use the lab results, it's not like buying a pound of sugar or buying a pound of flour. It's different laboratories producing different quality data. And so if the data that are being used by the data user are real important and make real important decisions based on those results, then they can hire an auditor to come in and look at the lab's operations and see whether or not the lab was operating in accordance with the scientific principles and had good quality control practices at the time the laboratory work was done. And so over the course of my career, the majority of my work assessing data quality and looking at labs has been done for the federal government, because they are probably the biggest consumer of laboratory results. They use a lot of analytical results, and so it's real, and they make very important decisions based on those results. So it's real important to them, to understand how reliable and how valid their data are.
Does your employment or has your professional experience involved review of commercial, private laboratories exclusively, or government exclusively, or combination, or what?
Mm-hmm. I've conducted audits for both commercial and government laboratories because, again, the government both operates as its own laboratory and contracts with commercial services. So I have audited state laboratories, federal laboratories, commercial laboratories, and in a wide variety of disciplines. These are labs test environment samples, food samples, pharmaceutical samples, the whole manufacturing, a whole gamut of samples.
So what arm of the federal government would employ you to do an audit of another government lab? I mean, one part auditing another part, right hand, left hand.
Well, I'm not sure that's exactly the way it happens. For example, I would be contracted by the US Navy to audit laboratories that did analytical work for the Navy. So that would include both Navy laboratories actually staffed by personnel as well as commercial laboratories. So it was, and the Navy, if you will, was the user of the results. And so they wanted to know how much confidence they could have, but it included, I guess, they were in different part of the Navy, if that's what you mean.
Okay. And why is it important that a government lab or a private lab be audited?
Experience has shown in the business of science, it's really, really hard to do science on a production line. I managed an analytical lab for Department of Energy a number of years, and it's really, really hard job to do. And that's what we're really asking if these laboratories who are testing unknown samples is to practice science day after day after day in a highly defensible and valid manner. It's really a hard job. And the experience has shown the measurement in the science business that the best way to ensure reliability and the validity of test results is to have very rigorous quality assurance program in place. It's not a management gizmo of the week. It's a very technical driven job, put into place quality control practice and measures to ensure that the consistently and reliably produce good quality data. So that's what drives it, ensuring that you understand the quality of your data and that your data is good enough so that you can make a good, confident decision based on them.
And does the government, federal government in the instance, in the situation that you had some experience in, do they ask for audits of, let's say, let's go to private labs for first a minute, just to check up and see if they're okay? Or are they sometimes concerned about more serious things in the use of tax dollars?
It's a little bit of both. And the nature of the problems can be either that the lab doesn't know they have a problem. So when you go in as an auditor, you're identifying a problem that they are largely unaware of. For example, I did some work on the Navy where they were interested in the presence of a particular contaminant in the water, in the bay water, and a laboratory reported that it was not detected. Lots and lots of samples. It was a very expensive analysis. Um, it was hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of analysis in question, and the laboratory reported it was not detected. But when I went in and audited the laboratory, I saw that the laboratory's detection limit was way up here and that the detection that the Navy was interested in, where they knew had to pay attention to, was way down here. So, in fact, the lab said it wasn't detected at its very concentrated level, really didn't answer the Navy's question. So they ended up on not having to pay for all the analysis because it's really, although it's true that the lab didn't detect it, it was really inappropriate for the Navy's use. And so they ended up not having to pay for it.
So you saved the Navy some money
Mm-hmm.
by showing that the laboratory just didn't provide what was asked for.
Correct.
Okay. And has some of your investigation also involved or uncovered any kind of fraudulent practices by laboratories, government or otherwise?
Yes. One of the things that you do as an auditor is you try to reconstruct things after the fact. All I'm dealing with after the fact is a pile of paper. And so I'm trying to reconstruct everything that happened with that sample from the time it was collected in the field all the way till it's ultimately reported on a piece of paper in a lab report, and try to understand whether all the controls were in place and the integrity of the sample was maintained and the results are valid and reliable. So that's the whole process. And I have kind of forgotten about the beginning of the question. I apologize.
Whether or not you have had any experience in detecting or anything fraudulent.
During the course of that process, for example, at a commercial laboratory, I determined that although it appeared that they had results and they had data, the paper data that looked like results, when you put it all together, I realized that they were actually reporting more data than had the capacity to generate in their instrument. It was likely they only had the ability with their instrument for how long the method took to run one sample in a day, and they were reporting results from many samples in one day. That meant that they were, in our local term, is a dry labbing. They were making up results. They weren't testing the samples. They were just making up results. Obviously, a clearly fraudulent practice that the government doesn't want to pay for. So that's the kind of big picture perspective that you look at when we're trying to audit laboratories.
And as a result of some of your work or investigations, has there been any criminal or civil penalties imposed on labs when they do that sort of thing?
You know, I just I just report it to the government. I don't know what they do as a follow-up.
Okay. By the way, I don't know if it was made clear, but where, who do you work for now?
In this case,
No, I'm sorry. What's your employment, your business?
I'm an independent contractor in my assessment duties as a forensic
Okay. Where is it based?
in the Albuquerque, New Mexico area.
Okay. Do you work, do you have any limits on where you work, or are you all over the place, or what?
I'm all over the place. I get data from all over the country, even from overseas. I have testified overseas as well.
And you've been doing this for approximately how long?
Well, I've been auditing labs and doing data quality assessments for many, many years. But do you mean specifically in the forensic discipline?
Sure.
In forensic discipline since the late 90s,
Okay. And in terms of auditing labs in general, how long has your career been in that?
since the 80s.
And have you published any articles or anything?
The business of data quality assessment, I'm working for people using the results, and they generally have priority use to the results than I report to them. However, when I was working for the Navy, I actually authorized their quality standard that they used for the evaluation of laboratories, and it essentially was rules of the road for the government commercial labs that they wanted to work for the Navy.
All right. Are you familiar with? We've had some testimony about different types of instruments that analytical chemists use. Are you familiar with liquid chromatography
Yeah,
and mass spectrometry? Spec-
yes,
and the instruments that are used for those kinds of tests.
yes.
Have you operated those kinds of instruments?
I have operated both.
Okay. Can you tell us what a protocol is?
hmm A protocol simply describes how a laboratory performs a particular method. It sets down the recipe, if you will, for how they treat samples and what controls they introduce, what it takes to have acceptable performance or not.
And as part of your auditing process, when you go to a lab, what things do you look at? Is it people, instruments, method, what?
And then some. The process of doing an on site laboratory audit personally, I find it very, very interesting because you always see things in person that you will just never see on the paper. So on site, I'm looking at everything from how they actually perform the manipulations, whether they use good laboratory practices, whether they seem to understand the principles in contamination control, which are so important in a laboratory, to look at the heating, ventilating, and air conditioning system. I'm looking to see where to make a the makeup vents provide air to see whether that could be a potential contamination problem. I'm looking at how they set up instruments. I'm looking at documentation maintained by the lab. I look at everything.
You look at the specifically protocols. Is that something that you examine, consider, and evaluate in the process of doing these lab audits you refer to?
Absolutely. Always read the protocols before going on site to understand how they say they do their method. And then watch them and look at the written work that they are generating to see whether they, in fact, followed their method. The nature of chemistry is such that it's so very important to follow protocols. For any time that you deviate from a protocol, then you've got to make note of it. It's a lot like a recipe. Again, if you don't follow the recipe exactly, then that chocolate cake isn't going to be as good as the one Grandma makes. But if Grandma doesn't want to share her recipe and she leaves out ingredients or doesn't really follow her recipe exactly, you're not going to be able to reproduce her work. The same thing applies in the laboratory. As scientists, we want to be able to reproduce somebody else's work. That means they have to have a completely documented protocol and they have to follow it.
And do you also, as part of this analysis that you go through, consider whether or not the protocol is being used for the purpose that it's intended and whatever limitations there may be in its actual scientific validity?
What you're referring to is essentially deciding whether or not a method is valid. A method is perfectly acceptable for use in one application, may be completely inappropriate for use in another application. So it's really essential to understand exactly the scope of what you're trying to use results for. When I managed the Department of Energy's analytical laboratory, people were always calling me up on the phone asking me, "So, can you analyze for beryllium?" Yes, sir, I can. And how long is it? How low can you go? What detection limit can you detect? They would ask me, and I would stop and say, depends on the question you're trying to answer, because the different methods depending on different applications of the results.
All right. Did you have an opportunity to review a report by a Dr. Mark LeBeau?
Yes,
And do you know who he is?
I do.
Okay,
Excuse me, is it okay if I get a drink of water?
sure. Isn't there one?
Yeah, thank you.
Usually there's some up there. All right, I'm going to show you some exhibits that have been marked earlier in this case and see if you can identify or recognize them. Do you see Exhibit 435?
Yes,
And what is that?
that's a copy of the FBI laboratory's report in this case,
By,
authored by Mark LeBeau.
okay. And have you reviewed that report?
Yes,
All right. And I'm going to show you what's Exhibit 434 and tell us what that is.
this is a 9-page standard operating procedure by the FBI laboratory that described their procedure, their recipe for analysis of EDTA in dried blood stains.
Okay. And the data of,
This particular procedure is dated 2/15/2007.
okay. And then also Exhibit 446. Can you identify that?
Well, without looking at every page, this looks like the package that I received for review in this case. That consists of a letter from your office as well as all the materials received from the FBI laboratory in this case.
Okay.
It's about the right size.
Okay. The Going to the report, do you have an opinion whether this protocol, as reported in the report, the use of this protocol as reported in the report can determine with scientific validity whether if a stain is tested for EDTA under this protocol and not found, whether that a conclusion can be given that it was not present in the stain?
I do have such a conclusion, and it's based on more than just procedure, but the fact that the stain, EDTA, is not detected in a stain does not mean that EDTA was not present in the stain.
Okay. Do you have an opinion about whether if one tests 3 stains and gets some results or lack of results, whatever, whether one can express an opinion about what may or may not be in the 3 untested stains?
Well, I'm in the business of analytical chemistry, and we're not in the business of just making guesses about what might be in a samples. We have instrumentation to test samples, and that's how we determine results. There's no way for an analytical chemist to know what's in a sample unless we test it.
All right. Going more particularly to the materials that you reviewed, let's talk about that protocol for a moment. Is 434, I believe.
Yes.
There's a section called scope. Does the protocol appear to be adequate for the scope as it's defined?
Yeah, it's a very short description of scope and it's accurate description of the applicability of this method. And it states the procedure allows for screening and confirmation of EDTA in suspected blood stains. So that's exactly what it does. It allows to screen for EDTA in a blood stain and to detect EDTA in a blood stain. I will mention that is probably the shortest description of method scope I've ever read.
Okay.
They are generally much more, there's a little more scientific meat in it in terms of describing under what conditions and so forth.
Does this protocol, as it's designed or reportedly designed here, you say that if one follows this recipe and there is EDTA present, that this protocol would allow one to detect it. Is that right?
To detect and identify it.
Okay. Is it also possible from this protocol to draw any conclusions, though, if one runs the test and does not detect EDTA?
That's really the problem. The issue with this procedure is not whether it's a valid result, but we're exactly detecting EDTA. This is a good method. If the results end up that you detect EDTA and you identify EDTA, that's a good indication that EDTA was present in the sample. The problem really occurs when the EDTA is not detected in a blood stain. And the problem in that regard is from this method, I don't know whether that's simply because they didn't detect it or because it wasn't there. I can't tell the difference between those two for this method. I don't know really what their method detection limit is, so I don't know whether they didn't see it or it wasn't there.
Okay. You mentioned detection limit. Is there also something called instrument detection limit?
Yes.
As you look at this protocol, or I'm sorry, look at the report for a moment, on page 2, where Mr. LeBeau indicates that using the procedure employed in this case, EDTA is readily identified in a concentration of 13 micrograms.
Milligrams per liter. The common term is parts per million.
Okay. As you go through the stack of data there that was provided to you, is that an instrumentation limit or is that a method limit?
From reviewing the data, that appears to be an instrument detection limit. That is, they figure out that by starting out with 100 parts per million sample, they would inject that right into the instrument and see if it could see EDTA, and they did. So they cut it in half, diluted it in half, and ran it again. When they ran 50, they still detected EDTA. And each time they cut it in half, When they ran 25, it detected EDTA. When they cut 25 in half at 12.5 or 13, they still detected it. But when they cut that sample in half and cut it down about 6 parts per million, they were not able to detect and identify EDTA. So based on that, they drew the conclusion that their detection limit was 13 parts per million. That, however, represents a sort of the theoretical base case of injecting a sample directly into the instrument. It does not reflect the detection limit for going out and swabbing a stain, extracting the sample from the stain, and diluting it before you get it to the instrument. Those are two different things. Instrument detection limits are usually very small. Method detection limits are larger. That's just sort of a natural order of things.
Okay. Well, focusing specifically on this type of method detection limit, why would it be different? Why would you be able to detect a smaller amount if you just inject the sample directly into the machine versus if you have to go through the process of taking a dried stain, swabbing it, extracting that, diluting it, all of that? Why is there a difference?
The difference is really because there are so many other complicated factors associated with taking a real-world sample and getting it to the point where it's clean and pristine enough to be able to inject it into an instrument. In the case of a blood stain, that sample is on a surface. It has to be removed from that surface, so it's swabbed. There may be interferences from the swab. They may not completely recover the stain. Then they try to extract the blood sample off of the swab. Extractions generally are not completely efficient. In some of the reference material, in this case, some work done some years ago, extraction efficiencies were typically 90% or so. And on the first run, it was quite common if you do multiple extractions to extract more DNA, or more EDTA. So in each step of the process, you will lose a little bit. There's issues that arise. And so by the time you get to the instrument, your effective method detection limit is much higher.
Is it possible to determine what the effective method limitation is, in this case, from the materials that you reviewed?
No, it's not.
Do you have an opinion whether it is the actual effective method limit of this test to be able to detect EDTA in a blood stain is higher than 13 parts per million?
Yes, I do. And I believe that it is.
Can you quantitate how much higher?
Unfortunately, that's a study that's been best done empirically by actually doing analytical work. Method detection limits are best determined using actual analytical work. I can infer some information from the data that were obtained in this case, but I can't just compute from one data that there are available.
And looking at the data that is available in this stack, the validation tests that were done, and those sorts of things, is there any indication that the FBI ever found out what the actual detection limit or method detection limit would be for this kind of a test?
No, there's no such indication in these data.
Okay. Well, what does that tell you about the use of this kind of protocol?
This kind of protocol, there's basically two things that can happen when you run this kind of a method. Either you detect EDTA or you don't. From an analytical perspective, the results either say, yes, we detect EDTA, or no, we did not. This report makes it seem like those two outcomes only can arise from two conditions. And it makes it seem as if the answer is yes, we detected EDTA in the blood sample, then kind of makes it seem like then that it means must have come from the tube of EDTA preserved blood. There was reference to the fact that the control samples that they took from the car were blank. So that's probably the more likely interpretation. The problems really come out of results from the testing are no, there is no EDTA present in these samples. Nothing there. We didn't see anything. The problem is you just don't know whether EDTA, you didn't detect EDTA because there was none there or because your detection limit wasn't low enough to see it, even if it had been there. So that's really the problem. So just because EDTA is not detected by the laboratory doesn't mean that that blood sample came from somebody actively bleeding onto that spot. It still means that if their detection limit's out of sync with the sample in question, there could be EDTA in those samples from the blood tube, and you just didn't see it.
All right. Now, the next sentence in his report, Dr. LeBeau's report, talks about that EDTA is also detectable when a 1 microliter drop of EDTA preserved blood is analyzed. As you reviewed the data in that 4 or 5 inch package there, would you agree or disagree with that statement?
I disagree with that statement.
And why is that?
Because the results in the report by the laboratory. If this statement says, I tested a 1 microliter drop of blood from a purple top tube, from an EDTA tube, and I detected it, the problem is, and that was done in this case, the problem is they ran a 2 microliter drop of EDTA preserved blood on a spot, a more real world kind of application, and they did not detect EDTA in this lab. Now, gosh, that might sound a little bit counterintuitive. What do you mean they could detect 1 microliter, but they couldn't detect EDTA in 1 microliter sample? If in fact the detection limit was used, this laboratory was down around that level, I just have to tell you, that's an unexpected result. Sometimes you see it and sometimes you don't. If an element of compound is present near its detection limit, in fact, that is essentially the definition of detection limit. It means that if it's present at the concentration, sometimes you'll see it and sometimes you won't. So to state that the EDTA is detectable when a 1 microliter drop of preserved blood is analyzed is really not a true statement, even as evidenced by his own results, because he did not detect it in a 2 microliter sample of blood.
Could you maybe find
I will try.
the information that's in there that you're referring to? And I'm just going to take a few moments to show that on the Elmo. Did you find it already?
Yes.
Okay, I have a copy. Let me just see if I can work from my copy while you have that, or else you can use my copy.
There's only 2 pages. Which one do you want?
Okay, why don't you use mine and I will use the actual exhibit on the Elmo.
Okay.
I'm going to start and just put this first page of the stapled packet together.
Oh,
Do you have that?
yes.
At the top, it says the date 2/16/07, 12/03/08.
Yes.
Okay, what is this?
This is essentially a set of data that came off the LCMS instrument from running the entire batch of case samples in this case. So it includes all the question samples, all the known samples, and all the control samples that were run by the laboratory in sequence, in time sequence. So you can sort of reconstruct what happened to which samples were run through the instrument plan. And boy, you will never be able to read that on top.
I can zoom in when we need to, believe me. And so is these kinds of reports what do you call these? Spectrographs, mass specs?
It's a chromatogram and spectra.
Are these the kinds of things that you see in your review of lab data?
On a regular basis.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Could we have this marked as an exhibit so we know what we're talking about?
I think it is.
This is part of the big package. This big one is called Exhibit 446.
I understand that, but I would like this exact page so we know what pages you're talking about.
Sorry.
Would you like to do that, Your Honor?
Is the page numbered in any fashion?
No, there are no numbers.
Unfortunately, no.
Alright, then let's label it as a Pacific exhibit.
Okay, what I would like to do, there's a stapled set. Just mark them all together and we'll talk about pages in there.
Okay. This includes all the sample that were run between 12:03 and 5:40 on February the 16th in the time sequence order.
And all right, we finally made it to 500, Exhibit 500. Can you tell us what that is?
Yes, this is a data test that represents all the results from the running case sample in this case. They were run on February 16th, and they started at 12:03 and ran through 5:51. And each of these takes about 11 minutes to run. So the time dates on each of them are about 11 minutes apart.
Okay, are these run, sort of automatically or robotically, or do you need to have a lab person there to do this?
Well, it's absolutely standard practice throughout the industry that these types of instruments, it's called rack and run. You set up your samples, you extract your samples, you load the tubes into the little sampler, set it in certain labeled positions. Then you let the instrument automatically or robotically sample them, typically at night while you're at home sleeping, and the instrument's in the lab working.
Okay, and then when you come in the morning, does it print out something like this for you?
Yes,
And these are then the reports that the analysts would review to determine if it seems like the test ran properly or didn't, and what the results are.
exactly.
Okay. All right. Now, the first page of these, I'm not going to bore everybody too much here with great detail, but at the top, just so people understand, on the upper left, there's a staple sort of blocking it, but it looks like a computer path, right?
Yeah, it's identification of the file. The instrument's collecting all these data electronically, and that's just the file where it's storing that data for the analysis to come in and look at it the next day.
So, for instance, where this says Excalibur data brewer being would be in this case the analyst.
Yes,
Okay. And as you go over towards the center, then it has the 2/16/07. That's the date and the time.
yes, that's the date and time stamp for the time that the data was acquired by the instrument.
All right. And then over on the right at the top, what is that referring to?
That's a description of the sample.
All right.
That's entered by an analyst at the time they are preparing this to set the run.
Okay. And so in each of these pages that I'm going to flip through, is it one page per sample typically, or can you determine that by what's up at the top?
You have to determine that by what's at the top. Often, well, sometimes they can zoom in so that there will be more than one page. So I can't give you
Okay.
a direct answer.
Very good. So this first one is a blank negative blood, and that's one of the controls you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
You have to say yes or no.
Yeah, it's a quality control sample.
All right. The next one is negative control,
Yes,
and then another blank,
2 more blanks.
2 more blanks. Okay. And then K2 extract. What does that mean?
That's one of the sample in this case identified as K2, and this analysis of an extract that was prepared from K2 from the K2 swab.
Okay.
So this isn't the case where they are actually taking a liquid sample, injecting into the instrument, because this blanks were, in fact, just liquid samples. This is a case where they took a solid sample on K2 and had to do extraction before they injected it into the instrument.
All right. And from your review of the materials, do you know what K2 refers to in general?
I could look it up. Under report, it's simply identified as 2 control swabs, item 9802. There's another record in here that describes there was taken from, I don't know, remember right off the top of my head.
Okay. The next page is another blank.
Yep.
2 blanks, actually.
Yeah, there's always 2 blanks in between each evidentiary sample.
Okay. And is that done in part to get rid of the possibility of effective carryover?
It's done to both get rid of the effectives carryover and to be able to identify in the event that it's happening.
All right.
It's very good quality control practice.
And by the way, let me just go back for a minute. At the bottom, turn to the very first page. At the bottom of each page, there's some handwriting. What does that refer to?
That is the initials of the responsible analyst who essentially made the call. On each and every sample, qualified analyst is responsible for deciding, well, is EDTA there? Isn't it? Is detection or a positive or is it not detected? So, and by signing it and making that entry on the page, that's acknowledgement that the individual has made that call. So in this particular case, the little just looks like a sort of scribbled M's or something. That's the initials of the analyst who made the call, ND or not detected for this particular sample.
Okay. And since this is a blank, you would expect it to be not detected.
You would hope so.
However, there's a line on it with the number 223 at the top. What does this indicate?
It indicates that blanks are not necessarily always completely blank, but the particular peak is not indication that it's EDTA that is present. So it doesn't create a problem for us.
Okay. So it's something, but it's not. It's not EDTA.
That's correct.
Okay. Move back ahead to where we were at Q46 extract.
Yes.
Okay. And this one, is there a call at the bottom of that?
Yes, not detected.
Okay. And then there's two more blanks, right?
Yes.
And the next is a K3 extract?
Yes, not detected.
Okay. And then the two more blanks.
Yes.
The second blank. Now, this one is a little bit different. There's a 223 showing up, but there's also a 293 showing up. What does that tell you, if anything?
Again, it tells you that the particular item detected, but this does not mean that the criteria for calling it EDTA, it's something, but it's not EDTA.
Okay. And so does the conclusion of EDTA is, again, another ND not detected?
That's correct.
Okay.
They're really only looking for EDTA here. If there's other things present, there's no attempt. And no, in fact, the method doesn't even allow for identifying what the other things were.
Okay. The next page then is
Ye-
Q47 extract.
Yes,
And you understand that to be one of the question samples.
that's correct. It's a swab. It's a swab extract.
And could you understand that the swab stains reportedly taken from the RAV4 were designated Q46, Q47, and Q48?
That's correct.
Okay. And this one is called also ND.
Yes.
Okay. There is, again, 275 detected, but that's not a concern as far as EDTA goes. There's something else.
That's correct.
All right. Bear with me. Two more blanks. K4 extract.
Not detected.
Not detected, even though there is, again, something there that's 208, correct?
Correct.
2 pages further, again, another blank. Not detected, but once again, there are things showing up. It's just not the ion.
They don't meet the rules for calling it an EDTA.
Okay. And then Q48 extract, not detected as well, right?
Right.
Okay. 2 more blanks. Now, let's talk about this for just a moment. You get to the page, it says positive control A, MALEDTA extract. As you review the data, what does this tell you, or what is this made of?
Well, from the data from the record, it's not really possible to tell. But my understanding is that this sample prepared by Mark Lebeau, MAL represents his initials, and that he volunteered his blood sample for this particular sample and created a purple top tube and extract, and that determined that he was able to actually detect EDTA in this sample of his blood.
Now, would that be considered a proper positive control in your opinion?
No, it's not.
And why not?
Control samples, there's rules, essentially, for control samples. Control samples are of known origin and purity. They have been tested and determined their actual composition. And then there's typically a certificate of analysis that tells you, we have analyzed it and we note with this degree of confidence that this is exactly what's in the sample. He essentially just took a sample out of the production line, his own, introduced it, and called it positive control. So it doesn't really confirm the quality standard for what positive control is.
So when you say a certified known quantity, but here this is a control in order, he is using this as a control just to find EDTA. Is that right?
Yes, to see whether he can detect EDTA during the course of this run.
So what would be a proper positive control for that?
If they had a whole blood standard, and there are supply houses that sell these kind of whole blood standards, they had a known quantity of EDTA present in it.
So there are commercial labs that sell certified specific
Yes,
things like this,
yes,
and those are intended to be used as a positive control.
that's correct. These are reference materials intended for that use.
Well, why would this be any different if he puts it in a purple top tube?
Because he doesn't know how much EDTA is in that purple top tube.
Okay.
So the fact that he detected it means was there, but how significant is that? Was that a very concentrated sample or a very diluted one? He doesn't really know.
Does the quantity of EDTA that one finds in these commercially prepared purple top tubes vary?
Yes.
By how much typically?
I don't know. I wasn't able to find any very specific actual lab data reporting that. But in the FBI lab's own protocols, they describe it as ranging typically from 1,000 parts per million to 2,000 parts per million. So it's a fairly broad range.
Okay. Now, at the bottom of this, there's some handwriting as well. What does this appear to be, or what does this tell you?
Actually, this is an indication that apparently this person whose initials look like some kind of an M went through and initially called this as a not detected, because you have seen this quite a few times already this morning. The initials in the ND circled, but subsequently analysis went back and decided, what I think is really meets to the criteria for being able to call it EDTA. So they changed their mind, lined out the not detected, and indicated that it was positive. And that's why there's a second M up there. They indicate that they made that decision to change that call.
Okay. And this is even on a sample of Mr. LeBeau's own blood.
Yes, this is a sample of an extract prepared from Mr. LeBeau's own blood.
Okay. And then you keep looking, bear with me again, another couple of pages of blanks. And then we get to something called positive control B, Q49 extract. What is this?
I have to interpret this based on the information you see there. They are calling this positive control and a second positive control in this run. However, it's an extract of Q48, which Q49, excuse me, which tells its questionable sample. It actually is an extract of Q49, which is the liquid blood sample from Mr. Avery. Why they are calling it a positive control? Truly, this puzzled me. This is puzzling to me. That is not what a positive control is. This is question sample. It's a case sample. It's an unknown sample as far as this laboratory is concerned.
Okay. And in this particular one, there's an indication of positive.
Yes.
Okay. The next page, what's this? It has the same heading or the
Same sample description, same date and time. This is a different display of the same electronic file. So all they are doing is going in and zooming in, and part of the spectrum, the previous page that in order to try to decide and confirm assignment. It's a normal kind of practice.
And so this reference up here, Zoom,
Yeah. Parenthetically, the analysis is what they're in, and note that this is simply a zoom of that same file.
so this is a Zoom page of the very same page right before it.
That's correct.
All right, 2 more blanks. And now we come to something called spot LOD, 1 microliter.
Yes.
This is also called a positive.
This sample is called positive, yes.
Okay, and the 3 ions that they seem to be looking for through all these tests are 160, a 247, and a 132, and certain ratio to each other, right?
You know what? I would have to look at those up. I would have to look those up because I haven't been that familiar with it. But there are certain characteristics, ions, that are EDTA, and it's not just the presence of those ions, but the relative ratios of those ions that matters to the interpretation.
Well, let's just go back for a second to Mr. LeBeau's own blood and see the ions that are reported here that are showing up as detected. The one that he had crossed out and then put positive, just a couple of pages back.
I must have missed it. Okay.
Okay, and what are the ions that are being reported by the instrument in this?
There are 3 ions that are reported: 132, 160, 147, 293. There's actually 4 that are present in this sample.
And 160 is the one that's always expressed at the highest is always up at the top.
Yeah, if you look at the scale there, it goes from 0 to 100 on the left. No matter how much of a compound is present, it always sets that at 100%. That's essentially percentage. And the highest peak is always set at 100%, and everything else is measured relation to that highest peak. Whether it's 1 inch tall or a foot tall, the highest peak is set at 100%.
And does that have any indication about the quantity of the
No,
substance that they found?
no, it's simply that the most abundant peak that we saw, and the ion that was there with the highest frequency, the most abundance, is set at 100. It doesn't relate to the quantity at all.
Okay, if we could flip back to where we were at the spot LOD 1 microliter a few pages later.
Okay.
Start at 5:07:38 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this one is marked as a positive, right?
Yes.
Do you see any, or what ions do you see expressed in this?
It has 3 of 4 that you saw in the previous sample. It has 160, 247, and 293.
All right. Now, what's the very next page?
A blank.
No, before that, the Zoom.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I was looking at the Zoom page.
Oh, you were. Okay.
Yeah, first page has the 3 ions. The second page, just like the previous example, is a zoom of the same result.
And even though it's a Zoom, there's still not a 132 ion showing, right?
That's correct.
But it's marked as a positive.
That's correct.
Okay, we're almost done. 2 more blanks. And now we come to the second to the last page of this exhibit. This is February 16, 5:40 at 13 seconds, right?
Yes.
It says spot LOD 2 microliters at Q49. By the way, just so we're clear, what does this tell you? The way it's designated as spot LOD?
It appears that the laboratory is trying to decide a detection limit for a sample of blood that's collected from Q49 file. That they are actually trying to use the purple top tube that was submitted in this case and trying to see whether or not I can see EDTA in a 1 microliter sample, whether or not I could see EDTA in a 2 microliter sample. So they're actually trying to empirically determine whether they can see whether they can even see the EDTA and they know that it's a sample from Mr. Avery's tube of blood.
And does this relate then to the sentence, the remark in Mr. LeBeau's report that specifically EDTA is detectable when a 1 microliter drop is analyzed?
Yes, this is a 2 microliters that's displaying on the screen right now. But I would conclude from his report that he is referring to when he ran a 1 microliter sample, he detected and identified EDTA. And so that's the source of his statement in the report.
That's the one we saw that shows 3 of the 4 ions, but is missing one of them.
Yes.
Now this one though, what's marked at the bottom of this page, is there any call made on this page?
Yeah, this is the 2 microliter sample. So they are taking
A bigger sample.
A tube of Mr. Avery's blood. And instead of just extracting 1 microliter stain, they're taking a 2 microliter sample of his blood and taking it through the process. In this case, when they ran it through their process, they did not detect EDTA. This is a sample that they took from Mr. Avery's purple top 2 microliters. They did not detect EDTA.
Well, on this particular page, his initials are there, but he doesn't appear to be making a call.
Yeah, I can infer from that he was going through these results when he expected probably to see EDTA because he had seen it in the 1 microliter sample. And when he got here, he probably said, oh, this doesn't meet the criteria. This isn't passing. What's going on? So if you go into the next page and he zoomed in.
I will in just 1 second, but this one does show a 133 ion, a 160, and where are we?
You're making me dizzy.
I'm sorry, and a 247, which are 3 of the ones you were looking at before. Why isn't he making a call that it's present in this instance?
I can only infer that because he doesn't indicate that in any of his records the basis for whether he made a call or not. However, this does not confirm the FBI laboratory's own rules for making a call because I got a copy of their procedure for mass spectral interpretation, and this has an ion ratio problem. You may recall that 160 is usually the biggest peak that relates to very characteristic ion.
Right.
In this sample, 160 is not the biggest peak. That this 293 is
over here.
Is the large peak. Yeah.
Okay, so then
it flaunts their own ion ratio rules for making an assignment.
Okay, so then what does he do then? What's the very last page?
On the very last page, he zoomed in to see if there was any more information he could elicit from doing a more detailed analysis.
And how can you tell this is a zoom of the very same results, other than obviously he's got it written there?
Again, it's because it's the same date and time, so it's the process. It's processing exactly the same electronic file, looking at the same data, just zooming in on it.
Okay.
Much like we can do when we zoom in on things on a computer.
And when he zooms in, does he have the same issue, the same problem?
Yes.
Once again, 160 is not at the right ratio. So then what does he call?
So he makes a call on this sample, this 2 microliter sample. It's not detecting any EDTA.
All right. Just so we're clear, there's one last page and it's a blank.
That's correct.
All right. So in this report then, when he says that EDTA is also detectable as low as a 1 microliter drop, his own data, does it support that at all?
The problem is he has data that indicates that he cannot detect EDTA in a 2 microliter drop. That kind of result is entirely consistent with the fact that this method has a hard time detecting at the concentrations in question here. It's an overstatement, if you will, to say I want to get the exact words. It's detectable when 1 microliter drop of EDTA's preserved blood is analyzed. That's an overstatement because his own data shows that he can't detect it in a 2 microliter spot.
All right. Now, his data he does express the opinion that EDTA was detected in Q49, the tube of Mr. Avery's blood, 11-year-old tube, right?
Yes,
Is there any data that quantitates how much that EDTA is there?
none.
You mentioned before that a new pristine, brand new blood tube sample, according to his own protocol, would be between 1,000 and 2,000 parts per million EDTA concentration, right?
Correct.
Is there any way to tell whether or not after 11 years the EDTA that would have been in Mr. Avery's purple top tube has degraded down to even a barely detectable limit?
There's certainly, if they quantitated how much EDTA was present, they did not do that. They simply identified the fact that EDTA was present in Mr. Avery's blood sample. They made no attempt to say how much EDTA was present. Obviously, I don't know how much was present 11 years ago, but they could have looked at the sample now to see how much was present in the blood today, but their method was not designed to do that and was never validated to do that.
So when they find a positive result for EDTA in that Q49 tube of Mr. Avery's blood, it could be 1,000 parts per million or 50 parts per million.
We just have no way of knowing. No way at all of knowing.
And is EDTA the kind of chemical that will degrade over time?
It's like any other chemical. It's dependent on the conditions and it's exposed to in length of time. Chemicals in general are subject to degradation from things like light, temperature, and biological activity. I don't know what the degradation curve is for EDTA, but in analytical chemistry, we put shelf lives on materials. And the manufacturers who certify their reference materials and who certify their results know how long the material is stable in that environment. So they assign a shelf life, much like the FBI did in their procedure. Their procedure for analysis of EDTA in blood stains has requirements for preparation of EDTA solutions, and they impose a shelf life on them. Say that their EDTA performance mix that has EDTA in water is stable for a period of at least 6 months. What that means is when you get past 6 months, they can't use it anymore. It's just like when milk is a week past its expiration date, you shouldn't be drinking it.
And that's their own protocol, imposes a 6-month limit on a solution that they mix up of known EDTA, right?
Yes.
Commercially purchased.
Yes. If reagent grade EDTA that's of known purity and we actually know its chemical composition.
All right. If you would step over here, please. We've had some problems today and yesterday with Mr. Strang's computer being able to project.
Mr. Bruton, can I ask how long you think your direct is going to continue yet?
Just one moment. Not much more. We could probably finish this in about 5 minutes, I think.
Alright, you can have 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Okay. For some reason, this is the videotape that we showed the jury a couple of days ago, and for some reason, I'm not able to get it up there, but it is on the computer screen here. Do you see anything that looks like an expiration date on this particular tube?
Yes.
Okay, you can retake your seat and tell the jury what you see as an expiration date on the 11-year-old tube of blood, Q49, that is Mr. Avery's blood that was found in the clerk's office.
These tubes are routinely manufactured and provided by their manufacturer with expiration dates. In this case, it's March of 96.
So when Mr. LeBeau tested this tube for the presence of EDTA in February of 2007, he was testing it approximately almost 11 years beyond its expiration date.
That's correct.
All right. Having reviewed all of this data then, by the way, were you able to see Mr. LeBeau's testimony recorded?
Yes, the online streaming video. I was able to see it there.
Oh, Okay. And did you see the PowerPoint presentation where he talked about his thought process or the hypothesis he was considering?
Yes.
And he mentioned only two. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Could you talk about that for a moment? What you think about that?
Yeah. He essentially says that when I get results from the laboratory, it either shows EDTA is detected or not detected. Those are the only two options. I agree that those are the only two options that can come out of a protocol. It's either detected or it's not. But then he draws the conclusion that in the event that it's not detected, which is the case here, in the stain samples, in the event of EDTA is not detected in the stain samples, he draws the conclusion that means it must have come from active bleeding rather than from Mr. Avery's tube. That's just simply not supported by the actual laboratory results in this case.
And why not? Is there some other conclusion?
Yes, it certainly is quite plausible that the blood stains that were swabbed from the RAV contained EDTA, but the lab simply was not able to detect it, as was the case in that 2 microliter sample of Mr. Avery's blood that they attempted to test and were not able to detect EDTA.
And for the record, we have finally been able to display the still frozen part of the video of I don't know the exact number, 1470, where the the tube of blood was opened at the clerk's office. And do you have a laser pointer available? No laser pointer here today?
Oh, I have one.
Oh, you do? Can I borrow it, please?
Sure, let me help you out.
There you go. Thank you. Could you point with the laser pointer, the laser, to what you were referring to when you were talking about the expiration date?
Okay, it's upside down here, so you have to see that it's upside down. It's right here. It says EXP March 96.
So from this data, well, let me just make it clear for the jury. First of all, were you able to actually test any of these samples in this case?
No,
All right. And when did you receive the materials that you have in front of you?
late on Tuesday this week.
Okay. But it refers to tests that were done just last week on March or February 26th.
This is probably the fastest turn on any data I have ever reviewed.
What would be a more typical length of time for one to develop a brand new protocol and validate it and do all that?
Development, validation, performance of the testing of the unknown samples is usually, there's no set rules, but it's usually something that takes considerably longer than the very aggressive time frame in this case. In this case, they were actually running these case samples before they even had the results of their competency sample. So it was very, very compressed.
And so from this data, can you express any opinion about whether the three as Q46, 47, and 48 question stains examined by Mr. LeBeau could have come from the blood sample, the blood tube Q49 that was also examined?
It's quite consistent with the results that were presented by the laboratory because of their inability to detect EDTA in the 2 microliter sample of Mr. Avery's blood. It's quite possible that those blood swabs could have come from Mr. Avery's blood tube, but simply not been detectable by the laboratory.
And what about the 3 swabs from the RAV that were not tested by Mr. LeBeau? Can any conclusion be drawn on that?
I'm an analytical chemist. I'm not in the business of just guessing on samples. We have to test samples to decide what's in them.
Is there any kind of we were talking about a limit of detection and what the method can detect, and a lot of this is technical stuff for us lay people. Is there any kind of analogy that you can draw about some sort of instrument or some sort of detection limit that we have?
You gave me an entree. We have pretty good detection limits. Our noses are able to smell things. People have different sensitivities to different smells. And That means we have different instrument detection limits, if you will. Some of us can detect things that are present at very, very low levels, and some of us require more of it be present before we can detect it. So our nose is analogous and to the instrument in terms of its ability to detect smell.
So if one was blindfolded and given say a warm apple pie or something and asked, can you smell an apple pie? Is that an example of your nose being able to detect something?
Yeah, yeah. And although I suspect that most of us who at least have well-functioning noses could have detected a warm apple pie if there were no complications. If that apple pie were present in the room with a lot of other smells, or the doors and the windows were open and there was a brisk wind blowing through, you might not be able to detect it. Doesn't mean that the apple pie is not there. It doesn't mean that it's not giving off odor, and it just means that you can't detect it. So that's the difference between an instrument detection limit and a method detection limit.
All right. And finally, as a matter of scientific adequacy, can the protocol that Mr. LeBeau developed, I think it's 434, be used to rule out the presence of EDTA in those 3 RAV4 bloodstains that were tested just because it's not detected in their tests?
No,
And why not?
because we just don't know what the method detection limit of this method was. As evidenced by the fact, and he could not detect a 2 microliter sample of Mr. Avery's blood, he couldn't detect EDTA in a 2 microliter sample of Mr. Avery's blood.
So even having gone through this test, is it possible that EDTA is or was in those 3 RAV4 stains?
Yes.
Thank you.
Alright, at this time we'll take our morning break. We'll resume in 15 minutes. Member of the jury, I will remind you again not to discuss the case, this morning's testimony, or any other element about the case during the break. Alright, counsel, we'll return in 15 minutes.
All right.
Mr. Gahn, will you be doing the cross-examination for the state?
Yes, I will.
You may begin.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I would first like to explore a little more. I looked over your resume and a little more of your experience, actual hands-on experience with LC-MS technology.
I have operated liquid chromatographs and mass spectrometers. I've not operated them configured, essentially connected together in the manner in which they were in this case.
Okay. And could you just describe the difference in the way they were connected together in this case and what you were familiar with?
I'm not sure I understand your question. The physical difference between how they are interfaced or...
No, if you yourself have not performed analysis or chemicals using the LC-MS technique.
That's correct.
Have you ever performed any type of analysis to test bloodstains for EDTA?
No.
Have you ever conducted any type of analysis to detect blood EDTA levels in a lavender top tube?
No.
How about any type of blood collection tube?
No.
You talked about the blood collection tubes, and in reference to the expiration date, what is your experience with blood collection tubes?
Part of what I do when I assess data quality, if the sample was collected in any particular container, be it blood, collection tube, or any other kind of container, part of what I'm doing is seeing whether that container was appropriate to protect the integrity of the sample so that its composition is not altered or degraded over time, to extend the possible that by its interaction with it in the tube. So whether it's in a quart jar or a purple top tube, I'm looking at, did they know that the container was of appropriate cleanliness before the samples were put in? And the type of thing, that type of thing. And these things are typically purchased in lots, and they are certified for a particular lot. So that manufacturer has actually tested those samples, made sure that they met their specific specifications, and certify the lot. If there's a problem, then they can go back and find out which lot causes the problem. Just like they could find out any peanut butter had problems and so forth. So it's a lot identification.
So again, what is your personal experience on how a purple top tube works?
My personal experience with how it works. Obviously, I have the same lay experience that everybody in the courtroom does with when I have had blood samples collected. My experience as a quality auditor simply reconstructing the paper trail associated with the integrity of that sample.
Are you stating that the expiration date on that vacuum applies to the stability of the EDTA?
No, sir.
What does the expiration date on the purple top tube, ma'am, apply to?
The expiration date is determined and assigned by the manufacturer, and it provides the user with the date beyond which they cannot certify the appropriateness of that tube for its intended use. That is, protecting the integrity of that blood sample. And that's a combination of all the things that go into that. It's a combination of maintaining the integrity of the vacuum, the EDTA. It's a package. They don't have separate expiration dates.
What can you point to that states that the expiration date on the purple top tube pertains to the stability of EDTA?
Nothing. It does not do that.
All right. I just want to make clear that the expiration date has to do with the efficiency of the vacuum in the tube. Isn't that true?
It's not just vacuum. It's the entire package for its for inappropriate use. They don't try to parcel out the parts.
You're not stating that because of the expiration date, the EDTA has broken down.
Oh, no, sir. No.
Thank you. That's all I needed.
Okay.
I just wanted to clear that up. Mr. Buting put up a number of exhibits that you looked at, and one of the things that I noted that you only looked at the results and what is concerned called the positive ion mode. Is that correct?
When we went through the page by page one,
yes.
This is the one on the 16th. I don't remember if this was positive or negative. I would have to go back and look at the sequence.
Could you do that?
Okay. No, sir, I believe it was a negative ion mode. Is there some misunderstanding of which date we're actually talking about?
My understanding is that the data that Mr. Buting put up for you to look at was from a positive ion mode. Is that correct? First of all, what is the positive ion mode?
It's just the operating mode for the instrument, whether you're looking at positive ions or negative ions.
And what does this look at for the EDTA? What is it looking for in the EDTA?
In the course of analysis, I believe you have probably already heard a brief introduction of this. A mixture is separated into its component pieces or its component chemicals with the use of chromatography instrument used with the liquid chromatography, and that each set of chemicals comes out or each package of chemicals comes out. It is introduced in the mass spectrometer where it is frag. This is subject to very high energy and fragmented. And when it breaks into pieces, the mass spectrometer then detects those characteristic fragments.
What I'm asking for is, in the positive ion mode, what form of EDTA are you looking at?
Well, I'm not. What I'm looking at, it's in this case.
In this case, what did the FBI's laboratory protocol, what form of the EDTA did it look at in the positive ion mode?
It's actually analytically, the sample can contain EDTA in any number of forms, and so it can be present as sodium salt. It can be present during the course of extraction. It's converted largely into during course of extraction and interaction with the blood, calcium, and iron. Is that you're asking whether it's the ion form or?
I guess what I'm looking for is whether it's what form and whether it's in its free acid form or in its metal or metal ion complex.
We can look for both.
You can look for both?
Oh, sure.
Okay. And what I'm asking you is, what form did the FBI look for in the positive ion mode?
Oh, I don't know. I believe it was the free acid, but I would have to look if that's what.
You don't have to. I will agree with you.
Okay.
Maybe we can come to some agreements here.
Okay.
And it will be easier for the jury.
Okay.
And in the negative ion mode, is it fair to say that they were looking for forms of EDTA not only in free acid form, but also in metal iron complex?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
Now back to my original question.
Okay.
The data that you looked at and you showed up on the big screen, wasn't that only from the positive ion mode? Only, in other words, only in its free acid form?
Yes, you are targeting specifically the ions attributable to that. From that one breakdown, yes.
So no data in the negative ion mode was shown on the big screen, correct?
I don't remember, but there's some in the package, if that's your question.
That's my question. Did you display or did Mr. Buting display any of the data in the negative ion mode, which would be in the free acid and in the iron complex forms?
I don't remember if he did.
Well, let me ask you this, ma'am.
Okay.
Do you remember reviewing that data?
Yeah.
And what did the data tell you in the negative ion mode?
Well, it's quite clear that I don't know what you mean. Which data are you talking about? But it's quite clear that the method is capable of detecting EDTA and in its iron complex, as I would expect to be the case.
So the protocol that the FBI put together is capable of making an analysis for the presence of EDTA in a lavender top tube, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And likewise in a non-preserved tube,
Yes.
and likewise in dried blood stains.
Yes.
Now, did you read any articles or publications that had to do with the analysis of EDTA in dried blood stains?
Only those articles that were provided by the FBI laboratory as part of their foundational reference material along with this case.
I'm going to ask that Mr. Fallon hand you 2 exhibits, and I would ask you to identify each of them for us, please.
Yes, sir. Exhibit 436 is an article from the Journal of Analytical Toxicology and the Analysis of EDTA. Sorry, I'm going too fast. In dried blood stains by electrospray, LCMS, MS, and ion chromatography.
Let's stick with that one just for a minute.
Okay.
Did you read that?
Yes.
And was that analytical chemistry or toxicology?
This particular one is analytical toxicology.
And the Journal of Analytical Toxicology, is that a well-recognized scientific publication?
Yes, it is.
And it's a scholarly authoritative in the field.
Yes.
And an article such as this would be a peer-reviewed article.
Yes.
And that article has also determined that it's possible to test for the presence of EDTA in dried blood stains.
That's correct.
And also, the article, which would be the next exhibit, please, could you state where that was?
That's an article from Analytical Chemistry, Exhibit 437, dated August 1st, 1997.
And that also is a scholarly authoritative scientific publication.
Analytical Chemistry is yes.
How about the analytical chemistry?
Yes.
And again, would that be peer-reviewed article?
I presume so.
And again,
this is web version. I don't know if this was one subject to the same peer review, but I would presume so.
And when you read the FBI protocol and compared it to those 2 articles, did you note any improvements that the FBI made in the development of the protocol that was used in the case?
Yeah, I would presume that there were several things that they did that would have been considered improvements against these early versions.
And could you tell us what those improvements were that they made?
Their extraction procedure is substantially different. One of these techniques used capillary electrophoresis instead of liquid chromatography. And they each have their own issue. They're using tandem mass spec. Mass spec in the FBI's method and the extraction procedures are substantially different. I would have to presume that they did Those because they considered it to be an improvement.
Do you believe it was an improvement by doing the analysis, looking for not only free acid form, but also the iron complex form of EDTA?
That would be considered a benefit.
Correct.
Yeah.
And why would that be a benefit? Why would you want to look for it in a negative ion mode in both forms?
Well, because it's better. Essentially, if you will, a better recovery, a better understanding the path the EDTA took in your samples.
So there were significant improvements made in this current protocol over the 2 articles that you...
Oh, certainly, yes. Science isn't static. We hope to improve it all the time.
All right. Thank you. With those significant improvements, I do know from your direct exam that you had a little problem with the uncertainty of their measurement system or their detection level.
Method detection limit, that's correct.
What is the difference between a qualitative assay and a quantitative assay?
That's a very good question. A qualitative assay or qualitative measurement doesn't tell you how much of something is present. It simply detects it and identifies it. So qualitative, I can say EDTA is present, but it says nothing about how much EDTA is present. In contrast, the quantitative assay tells you how much of something is present. There is entirely different collaboration protocol to get how much of a given compound there is.
And both are scientifically sound procedures?
Absolutely.
And how would you characterize the FBI's protocol or testing methodology in this case?
This is purely qualitative method.
And that, again, is a valid scientific method of developing an analysis methodology.
Absolutely.
Now, if you would, please pick up their protocol, please. Do you have that?
The FBI's protocol?
Yes, please.
Yes. Okay.
On page 7, under paragraph 14, limitations, number 8, limit of detection, it was your testimony that this was under a valid method for determining their limits of detection.
It's not a universally used method, but it's an appropriate means of getting to an It's not a universally used method, but it's an appropriate means of getting to an instrument detection limit.
And one that could be used in detecting the levels of EDTA, whether in a purple top tube or in a dried blood stain?
No. The method that they referred to in this paragraph, is simply a means of determining an instrument detection limit. So it detects how much. It gives you an indication of how much EDTA you can detect from a solution that you actually take a syringe, inject into the instrument. It doesn't tell you anything about how much EDTA you can detect from the stain sample.
But this limitations in their protocol clearly state, and the data shows that they're able to detect 1 microliter drop is readily detectable in this protocol.
I don't believe that that's true.
So when they state that the 1 microliter drop was readily detectable using this technique, are you saying that's not true?
That particular statement is a reference to this paragraph about a separate LOD study where some EDTA was placed into a lavender top tube. That's not what I'm referring to when I say they had a problem detecting it in 2 microliter spot. I'm referring to the actual case samples in this case, where they were not able to detect from a 2 microliter set of blood of Mr. Avery's blood, as opposed to this one, which is more sort of a theoretical, pristine case.
I think we're talking about the same thing, but maybe my question was not very good.
Okay.
The system that they developed, the methodology that they developed, allows them to detect levels of EDTA to the 1 microliter level.
Okay. The reason that's not true statement generally is because we don't know how the concentration of EDTA that's present in that microliter. I don't know if there's 100 micrograms or 1 microgram present in that 1 microliter sample. So saying it's possible to detect EDTA in 1 microliter of blood really scientifically doesn't mean much unless you also know concentration of the EDTA. In this case, they state that 1 microliter drop that they that they prepared from a whole blood sample and known EDTA, they knew the concentration of the EDTA in that sample. I was unable to find the data related to this particular experiment that they described. It wasn't in this package, and as far as I could tell.
And that would be important in a quantitative aspect.
It is absolutely important in a quantitative essay, but it's the reason it's important quantitatively, because when you say not detected, it's not detected at what level? When it's not detected at a very, very concentrated level, or is it not detected very, very weak level? If I have my glass of water here and I drop a 2 crystals of sugar, there is sugar in my water, but I may or may not be able to detect it. If I run it by some technique, I may say not detected. It doesn't mean it's not there. It just means I can't detect it. I'm sorry. If I run it by the method with a very high detection limit, I won't be able to find the sugar. It doesn't mean it's not there. It just means I can't find it. If I put a lot of sugar in there, that method might be able to detect it, and I would say, yes, I saw sugar in that water. So it really depends on how much sugar is in my water sample or how much EDTA is in the blood sample.
When you looked at the data, did the testing procedures employed by the FBI detect at the 1 microliter level EDTA in the blood tube of Stephen Avery?
In the 1 microliter sample that they reported, a single instance, yes, they did report a positive for EDTA. The 2 microliter sample, they did not detect EDTA.
But again, that was just looking in the positive ion mode,
Yes, that was the same set, yes.
Just the free acid form.
Yes.
Did you look at the negative ion form in the more sensitive testing?
I believe that by the FBI's own data, they indicate that both methods are comparably sensitive. They report the same detection instrument detection limit for both. Let me look and see if I can find some negative here. Okay, I'm not sure this is your question, so tell me if I'm off track here.
Would it be helpful if I were to put it up on the big screen, the 1 microliter result from the tube of Stephen Avery's blood?
I completely concur that shows the positive detection and identification of EDTA.
And what I'm saying, though, ma'am, is what you put up during direct exam was just in the positive ion mode. I would like to put it up in the negative ion mode.
Okay.
Also,
Okay.
would that be helpful for you to, instead of trying to?
Well,
I will go directly go for it. Go to it.
Okay, thank you.
And could you look? Does this state that these are in the test results in the negative ion mode for the 1 microliter?
Yeah, I don't know where that is in my package, but yes, that's what that looks like.
Okay, but did you see this and review this?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of stuff here.
And EDTA is clearly present in the negative ion mode. This is in the acid-free as well as in the iron complex in the tube of Stephen Avery's blood at the 1 microliter level, right?
The way the laboratory runs their protocol, their screening and confirmation, and they essentially have to have confirmation both ways. They have to have a positive in both techniques. That's why, frankly, once I saw that it was not detected, I didn't spend a lot of time looking at the rest of it. But I will try to find this if that's okay.
Or if we zoomed out more.
I don't see the analysis column here. So to see a criteria that they used, okay, thank you, that helps.
We can set it up this way, any way you like. And look through the files if you want. If this is helpful, we can move on. Can you work with this?
That's just fine, yeah.
Does this show that EDTA is present in the vial of Stephen Avery's blood at the 1 microliter level?
No, it doesn't, because there's inconsistent results for that conclusion from the other technique. You know, when you do it practical analytical chemistry, you don't get a cherry pick which results you want, accept or not. You run a given sample through an instrument.
What is about the data that is on this form in front of you that states that EDTA is not in Stephen Avery's blood?
Nothing.
Nothing?
Nothing.
Okay, so I will ask again, at the 1 microliter level, in the negative ion mode, looking at the free acid form, as well as the iron metal complex form, EDTA is present in the tube of Stephen Avery's blood at the 1 microliter level?
As called here, that is a correct statement.
Thank you.
Sorry.
That's fine. Also, do you remember looking at the data at the 2 microliter level?
Yes.
In the negative ion mode?
No, I don't. I don't remember that. I'll bet you can put it up there for me, though.
I bet I can. Would you like to look at that too?
Please.
And again, what I'm going to ask is whether in the negative ion mode, looking at the free acid form and the metal complex, iron complex, that EDTA is present at the 2 microliter level?
It appears that the analysis has called it a no in this case. You know what? I'm sorry, I can go on. You zoom in a little more.
Sure.
Right up here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, it appears that the analyst in this case has called this a no. And if you go back in the kind of left side where he's the left side of the page.
Zoom out.
Yeah. Be easier if you back up a little. Down lower. There we go. Clearly, that in this case, actually, if you go a little bit down, it will be more obvious that there is really nothing to show there. Yeah, in this particular case, this 247 ion, there's an indication that they simply did not detect. And the analysis in this case is speculating as to whether the possibility may have been a weak injection.
Correct. But at the 1 microliter level, in the negative ion mode, which we saw before, EDTA is in the blood tube of Stephen Avery.
Based solely on that data, yes.
Now, and clearly, whether you are in the positive ion mode or the negative ion mode, EDTA is present in the 5 microliter sample of Stephen Avery's blood in the tube, correct?
I don't recall ever seeing data from a 5 microliter sample of Mr. Avery's blood. I only recall seeing 1, 2, and the actual lead sample. In the actual sample of Mr. Avery's blood, I recall seeing a 1 and 2 microliter spot sample and what they called a positive control from the Q sample.
But this morning, or earlier this morning, Mr. Buting put up the positive control B.
Yes.
Which you?
Yes.
And you recognize that that's the 5 microliter level. That's the 5 microliter level from his EDTA tube.
Oh, I see. I see what you're saying. I think that particular sample, I have no way of knowing exactly how much sample they used. Because the sole identification of that is positive control Q-49.
But ma'am, in their notes, they don't clearly state in their handwritten notes that for the positive control B, 5 microliters.
All these samples have a 5 microliter injection volume. That's just how much of the sample is injected into the instrument, but it's not how much of the blood sample is injected in the instrument in that case. It's how much of the extract volume is injected into the instrument. Those are 2 completely different things with completely different concentrations.
Are you stating that the positive control B, Q49 extract is not the 5 microliter level of Stephen Avery's blood from the tube?
As I understand it, that was prepared extract sample. And I will just mention there are very few words in this document. I can only infer from sample description, sample titles.
Would you like to look at the handwritten notes?
On the one that's been admitted previously?
No, it might be easier if I were to bring you what I have.
Okay.
Instead of And I recognize that such a large volume is difficult for you to go through. We'll put it up on the screen, and then if you feel as though you want to look through your notes to find that section.
Okay.
And do you see where it says positive control B? It's probably the third little hash mark down from the notes. Positive control, 5 microliters.
Can you zoom in on that, please?
Sure.
Okay.
You see that?
Uh-huh.
So when you put up this morning the positive island mode for the examination of the analysis of this positive control that showed that EDTA was present in the tube of Stephen Avery, this was a 5 microliter level.
I'm sorry, but that's a misunderstanding. If you continue to read here, it says 5 microliters of blood was pipetted onto a clean cotton swab. So he was not just taking 5 microliters in injection into the instrument. He was taking 5 microliters and putting it into a swab, and ultimately, then it gets into an instrument. Now, that's analogs to if I'm not sure I'm understanding you properly, but that is just analogous to the sample that I had concerns about, the 2 microliter sample. It's directly analogous to that. In terms of what it's directly injected into the instrument, it was placed on a swab and then was extracted.
We agree that positive control B, Q49, the tube of Stephen Avery's blood,
Mm-hmm.
then that in the data that you looked at the 5 microliter level, EDTA was present?
Yes, sir, it was.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I thought that was likely very clear.
My questions may be inarticulate. I don't know.
I want to make sure I answer the right one.
And you did. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So now when you're talking 1 microliter, 2 microliters, 5 microliters, it's an awfully small amount.
It sure is.
And I think you said on direct exam that sometimes, you get down there and it can be things that can cause, when you're down that low in your detection levels, whether 1 or 2 microliter, something that can skew one way or the other. Is that what you said, or?
Well, it's just that when you're down that low, it's a more complicated analysis and there are more variability, if you will, in the results. If the sample concentration is homogeneous, any number of things can cause differences.
But the data that we have just put up, as far as the 1 microliter of Stephen Avery's blood, and when we're talking 1 microliter, it's about like 1/50th of a drop, correct?
Right. And that's only a very small fraction of a drop. If you look at this little pipette, it would be obvious how small it is.
And that's a very small amount we're dealing with.
Yes, it sure is.
And down to that level, EDTA was detected in the blood of Stephen Avery.
In the 1, not in the 2.
Pardon me?
In the 1 microliter sample, not in the 2 microliter sample.
But also in the 5 microliter.
And in the 5 that they call the positive control. That's correct.
And some artifact or some interference or whatever may have caused the 2 microliter level to, under their protocol, to not call it.
Sure. That's why they do. That's why you do detection limit studies, because detecting it sometimes and not detecting it in other times is entirely the kind of thing you expect if you are operating at the detection limit.
It's not unusual?
That's not unusual.
And even in the 2 microliter level, the presence of EDTA was indicated but wasn't called, maybe because the ratio with one of the other islands was out of place. That's all.
Well, in analytical chemistry, close doesn't count. You either call it or you don't.
Correct, and they didn't call it.
That's correct. They did not.
But still, when you looked at the data, and at the 2 microliter level, the presence of EDTA still was indicated.
That's correct.
Okay, now maybe we don't have to go through all of the graphs. When you looked at the extract Q46, which was under Q46, do you know which one I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm.
When you looked at the data in the positive ion mode and the negative ion mode, correct?
Okay.
No EDTA was detected.
I will look just to make sure, but that's my recollection.
Okay,
That's correct.
and then that Q46, as you know, is a bloodstain from the dashboard of the RAV4.
That's correct.
And on Q47 extract, which was a bloodstain from the rear passenger door of the RAV4,
Yes,
no EDTA was detected.
that's correct.
And on Q48, which is a bloodstain from the CD case that was in Teresa Halbach's RAV4, in the positive ion mode, as well as in the negative ion mode, no EDTA was detected.
Correct.
I'm going to show you a picture of the swabs. Have you seen the photographs of these swabs that were
Xerox copies. I haven't seen the photographs themselves.
would those be helpful to see the photographs then?
I can.
Okay. I want to show you this was where this would be Q46. This would be where the swab was taken by the crime lab analyst.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to show you now a photograph of the swab Q46 that was sent to the FBI for testing in this case. Now, again, we're dealing with a 1 microliter, which is, I think we agreed, 1/50th of a drop.
Okay. Here's the problem. We don't know what the volume we're dealing with. After, we don't know what volume of blood was deposited on the dashboard. If you're referring to these photographs,
Yes, ma'am, I understand.
you said okay.
What I'm stating is that the detection limit for the FBI protocol was that they can detect the presence of EDTA at the 1 microliter level. Isn't that what the study stated?
It stated that. I don't believe the data supported that conclusion.
But you just stated that there was no EDTA present in the extract Q46 from the dashboard.
True. But you can't run a detection limit study on unknown samples. That's an unknown sample. We don't know whether EDTA is present in that sample or not. You can only run detection on a set of unknowns.
And there was no EDTA detected on the rear door of Q47.
That's correct.
And there was no EDTA detected on the stain from the CD case in Teresa Halbach's car.
That's correct.
Yet, in the blood tube of Stephen Avery, clearly in the 1 microliter level, in the positive ion mode and the negative ion mode, testing for free acid EDTA and metal iron complex EDTA, it was present.
It was present and confirmed in the 1 microliter sample.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's all I have, ma'am.
Any redirect, Mr. Butin.
Yes. Just let's pick up right there for a moment. Mr. Gahn was limiting very carefully his question to the 1 microliter level. But as we have shown and discussed here, both direct and cross, the data that the FBI, the only data they generated shows different results when you test an even larger stain at 2 microliter in the positive mode, right?
That's correct.
To an analytical chemist, what does it mean then when you get what appears to the layperson to be inconsistent results?
I can certainly see how it seems inconsistent, but just based on my experience with detection limit studies, that's not an unexpected result. If you are trying to analyze samples that are not or near detection limit, the fact that sometimes you will see them and sometimes you won't, even at slightly higher concentrations, is not an expected result.
But does it allow you to draw the conclusion that Mr. LeBeau did in his report that therefore this protocol is detectable, or shows that EDTA can be detectable as low as 1 microliter?
I believe that's not supported by the data.
Let me go back to the beginning of Mr. Gahn's questioning for a minute, because I want to make sure that it's clear to the jury. He asked for your opinion about whether or not this protocol was sufficient to test for the presence of EDTA, correct?
Correct.
And you agreed that it is.
It is. If it detects EDTA, it's a reasonable conclusion that it is present.
Okay. Is the protocol also, however, adequate or not adequate to establish the absence of EDTA?
It is insufficient to establish the absence of EDTA at or near its detection limit.
All right. So you can use this protocol in one way, but you can also incorrectly use it in another way.
Yes.
And in this, Dr. LeBeau's attempt to use this protocol to exclude the presence of EDTA in the bloodstains, is that a correct or incorrect way of using this protocol?
I believe that's incorrect.
The question about the expiration date for a moment. On the tube, you indicated the manufacturer's expiration date is for the whole package,
Correct.
part of which is EDTA, right?
Yep.
And as far as the stability of EDTA and its how long it lasts without beginning to degrade, does the FBI's own protocol establish only a 6-month limit for a known reagent quantity EDTA solution that they prepared?
That's correct.
And in so doing, does that limit in their protocol express an opinion about the stability of the EDTA in that solution?
Objection, Your Honor. Foundation for that question.
Sustained.
Is the fact that the FBI themselves, when they mix up a solution of EDTA in their protocol, the fact that they limit its use to only or approximately 6 months, is that an indication then of, is that a shelf life?
That is effectively a shelf life.
And is that similarly, is that similar to the kind of shelf life that manufacturers put on products?
Yes. Use it after the shelf life at your own risk. It may or may not be what they put into it.
Okay. Let me just clear up a little bit the whole idea of detection limit. When you get down to a detection limit for a sample, does that mean that at that limit you are 100% of the time able to find what you expect to find?
No, it does not. It means that 50% of the time you will be able to see it, and that the rest of the time you won't.
Really? So it's an equilibrium sort of, a null, or what would you call that?
I wouldn't really call it an equilibrium because that means something pretty different. But it's like you are trying to see whether or not there is one spike growing out of the field of grass and there's a lot of variability, and you're trying to see if one of them is big enough than the rest, bigger than the rest of them, enough that you can detect it.
And what you're saying is when a chemist establishes a limit, a lower limit of detectability, whatever that level is that's found, even there, 50% of the time, the substance may be present and not detected.
At the concentration, yes.
And the other 50% of the time, it would be detected.
Yes. When you get about an order of magnitude above a detection limit, that's a point where you can start to quantitate. You have to be higher than the detection limit to be able to quantitate. At the detection limit, it can only tell you whether or not it's there. It can't tell you how much is there. In order to be able to tell how much is there, you actually get a quantitative analysis to have to be substantially above the detection limit, the instrument detection limit.
And you mentioned early on in the direct about some experience that you had with the Navy trying to examine the limits of detection that a particular protocol actually is designed to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to say yes or no. I'm sorry.
Yes, sorry.
And in that instance, I believe you said you found that even though the lab was reporting that to the Navy, that this chemical in the bay was not present, by reviewing the same kind of data you're seeing now, you were able to determine that that was a worthless opinion because the level was simply too high.
Yeah. It was meaningless in that particular application. It wasn't exactly the same kind of data. It was LCMS data. It was actually a different instrumental technique.
Okay. I don't want to confuse things then. So finally then, when Mr. Gahn asked you, based on this test and this data, whether or not EDTA was detected in Q47, Q46, Q47, and Q48, does that mean that none of those samples have EDTA in them?
Not necessarily.
Because of what you talked to us before about detection limits.
Yes.
So you can conclude then that any of the RAV4 stains that were examined by the FBI could not have come from the blood tube that contained Mr. Avery's blood.
I can't conclude that.
Based upon the data that's presented there, generated from the FBI's own test.
Right.
Thank you.
Anything else? Mr. Gahn.
Just a few follow-up questions. Again, back to this tube and the Vacutainer tube and the expiration date.
Okay.
You're not stating that in the March of 1999, EDTA broke down and was not present in that vial.
No. In March of 96, when it hit its expiration date, it doesn't suddenly go bad on April Fool's Day. Just like milk doesn't suddenly go bad on its expiration date, but that's as far as the manufacturer can certify to its acceptability.
But doesn't that expiration date really have to do with the vacuum? That they can't guarantee that the vacuum of bringing blood from the vein into the tube is going to operate?
That's a serious limiting factor for those tubes. Yes, absolutely.
And that's what they were stating by that expiration date, correct?
You know, it sounds subtle, but it is a system for its intended use. If you go back and you look at the manufacturer specs for these things, that's the way they describe them. They always talk about intended use.
But probably most noteworthy in this case is that the blood is still in its liquid form 11 years later.
Yeah, it is.
And that means that the anticoagulant is working very efficiently.
That's correct.
And that's due to the EDTA in the tube.
That's correct.
Thank you, ma'am. That's all I have.
Thank you.
A real couple quick follow-ups. If the tube Q49 that Mr. Avery has says it's got EDTA in it on the label, right?
Yes. Well, it doesn't say it has it. It's implied by the presence of the purple top.
Okay, but I haven't brought that actual tube out here for you to look at, but assuming that it does, then it would not be terribly surprising that some level of EDTA would be detected in that still liquid form, right?
I would have expected that, yes.
Okay, but the real question that is of interest here is the stains in the car of the vehicle, right?
That's correct.
And that's what you're saying Dr. LeBeau's report cannot rule out.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Alright, members of the jury, at this time we're going to take a lunch break. I will remind you again not to discuss the case in any fashion during the lunch break. We'll resume about 1. You may be seated. You may be seated. Will the defence be ready to go at 1?
Yes, we will.
With the next witness?
Yes, we will.
Very well. We'll see you then. Mr. Strang, at this time the defence may call its next witness.
Thank you, Your Honour. And actually, before I do that, and while I'm thinking of it, I would move into evidence exhibits 499 and 500, which relate to Miss ARVIZU.
Any objections?
No objection.
Very well. Those 2 exhibits are admitted.
And then the next witness is Dr. Scott Fairgrieve.
Please remain standing and raise your right hand. Please be seated.
Thank you.
Please state your name and spell your last name for the record.
Yes, my name is Dr. Scott Fairgrieve, Fairgrieve.
Are we good on volume? Maybe just pull the mic down a little bit?
Is that better?
Yes, probably so, yes. Good afternoon. I wonder if we could start, Dr. Fairgrieve, with explaining to our jury why it is that we brought you down from Laurentian University in Ontario, Canada.
I was requested by the defense counsel in this particular case to review the reports and circumstances surrounding the investigation of the Avery property, and specifically with respect to cremated remains in this case and the forensic anthropologist report.
And how in general are you employed?
I'm currently employed as the chair of the Department of Forensic Science at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario, Canada. And I'm also a forensic anthropology consultant to the Office of the Chief Coroner for Ontario.
Okay, let me show you your curriculum vitae, which I have marked as Exhibit 501. And we'll give the people a little bit of an overview of who you are without, I promise you, and without going through all 18 pages of this.
Okay.
You have a bachelor's degree?
Yes, I have a Bachelor of Science in Biological Anthropology from the University of Toronto.
Where did you take your education after that?
I then proceeded on to do my master's level degree at Cambridge University in England, also in biological anthropology.
What is biological anthropology?
It's the examination and my specific specialty of the human skeleton. We also refer to it as a human osteology, and I'm an expert or received education in the area of the analysis of the skeleton in the variety of contexts, both archaeological and modern.
Did you attain, a master's in philosophy in biological anthropology from Cambridge University?
That's correct. It's referred to as an MPhil degree.
All right. You come back from Great Britain, obviously, at some point, back to Canada. And where do you go with your education from there?
From there, I attended the University of Toronto for my doctoral degree, a PhD in human skeletal biology within the anthropology department.
When did you obtain the PhD?
In 1993.
And what have you done in general, big picture? What have you done with your professional life since you completed the doctorate?
In general, I have obviously, as a forensic scientist, I belong to several associations, but in my actual work, I'm employed since 1991 and at Laurentian University as a forensic anthropologist and have undertaken teaching courses at the undergraduate level.
Where is the Laurentian University specifically?
It's in the town of Sudbury, Ontario, which is a very well-known mining community. It is located approximately 4-hour drive north of Toronto.
Give us a rundown, if you would, on a little bit more about the faculty position you hold as chair of the Department of Forensic Sciences at Laurentian?
Well, I oversee the operation and administration of the department. However, I'm also a teacher, if you like, a university professor. So I instruct students in various different courses, including forensic biology, introduction of forensic science, forensic anatomy of the human skeleton, as well as the forensics analysis of the human skeleton.
Outside of an undergraduate or graduate student's classroom, do you do any training or teaching of law enforcement?
Yes, I have. I was invited back in, I believe it was 2002, to form the very first course in recovery of human remains from crime scenes for police officers, what we refer to in Canada as forensic identification officers. Here, they would be crime scene technicians, and that went until 2005.
Are you involved in research as well as the practical work you described?
Yes, sir. I am very active in research.
What is your primary area of research interest?
My primary area is in the study and interpretation of cremated human remains. So any human tissues that are subjected to fire in a variety of circumstances, but more commonly in the forensic circumstances.
Have you written anything about this?
I am published in the area of forensic remains through journal articles as well as book chapters and conference presentations. And I have an upcoming book coming out through a publisher in the US on the forensic cremation analysis and interpretation.
And we can look for that at Amazon.com soon?
I'm hopeful.
All right. Now, again, the jurors, I think, will probably have your resume, so I don't want to go through everything. But give the jury a sense of the professional associations to which you gravitated or that you found, to enrich your work.
Professional associations are very important to a scientist in growth for both peer review of your own work, but also further training and basically communicating with other members of your field. I'm known as a fellow in the American Academy of Forensic Sciences with the Physical Anthropology section. I am a member of the American College of Forensic Examiners International, and I'm also on the editorial advisory board for their publication known as the Forensic Examiner.
Actually, I'm going to stop you right there.
Yes?
We have heard talk about peer reviewing articles. Is that exactly what somebody on the editorial advisory board does?
Well, in my case, from the editor of a specific journal, I would receive the actual article in question and they ask me to examine it for the science behind the article in order to make sure that the procedures followed and the way that the article is written conforms to scientific standards.
You are describing peer review. Is that what peer review is?
That's exactly what it is, literally a review by your colleagues.
Okay. Are any of the professional associations to which you belong titled towards law enforcement or defence in the criminal justice system?
Forensic science, as we deal with it, is meant to be an unbiased profession. We're to undertake analysis of evidence and present our findings of that evidence in courts of law via either reports or through reports and testimony, such as here.
Have you testified in court before today?
Never in American court, however, in Canadian courts, yes.
And I'm actually curious who has called you as a witness in the past. Which side?
I have only testified for the Crown in Canada, which is the equivalent here would be prosecution, so the state.
Okay. This is the first time both in an American court and being called by the defence?
That's correct.
Okay. And I want to get now into the more practical or field work that you do. And I'm curious, is there a tie between the research interest in cremated human remains or cremains and the practical field work that you do?
Yes. Well, my interest in cremains came out of the fact that I was being called in order to not only recover in the field cremated remains from crime scenes, but also to interpret those remains. And so my research was very much centered on the problems and the challenges that one encounters with remains that are in such a degraded state.
Do you find yourself still called to consult at crime scenes?
Yes, I am. I'm currently a consultant for the Office of Chief Coroner in Northern Ontario.
Which covers how big an area?
Approximately Western Europe, land area very wide from Sudbury up on through Northern Ontario, right up to Hudson Bay.
Okay, so just part of the province.
Yes.
But a large land area.
Yes.
And who calls you into crime scenes?
Usually the procedure is I'm sometimes contacted by the police to tell me that there is a scene that they will suspect they will want me to attend. However, as per our protocol, I'm called to the scene and to attend by the regional supervising coroner. And so I represent the regional coroner as far as activity is concerned.
So you may be working shoulder to shoulder with police officers, but you are there under auspices of the coroner, if I understand.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. When you have a case, you are called to the field, crime scene or suspected crime scene, and you have got cremated human remains.
Yes.
What are the tasks for a forensic anthropologist like yourself in that role?
Well, initially, what we do is I will certainly meet first with the law enforcement officials who are responsible for the investigation as well as the forensic officers. And I will get background information from them prior to even attending the scene. And then upon attending the scene, we will examine the general area in order to how to approach. I usually check to see if there is a path of contamination that has been initiated. And we essentially work from the outside of the scene to the inside. So I'm very much there working shoulder to shoulder with the forensic identification officers at the scene and offering advice on how to do the recovery.
Okay. And that's what we're talking about.
Yes.
We're still at a point where we're trying to recover.
Oh, yes.
Remains.
Oh, yes.
when it was at the site?
And documenting those remains at the scene.
Okay, so contamination path, and I think you just said you work in
Yes.
from the edges.
Yeah.
What are you trying to do?
Well, we're first of all trying to preserve the context of the evidence as best as possible and to do as little contamination as possible to the actual scene. So, by having a path of contamination, this is a pathway, if you like, that the police officers will have established saying, well, this is the way we got onto the scene originally, so we're just going to keep walking on this path and not possibly contaminate outside of that pathway.
Okay, so in addition to preservation, then, what would be the next task?
Well, as with anything, as items are identified, and typically because we're dealing with cremains, I'm on one to identify, okay, this is a cremain and that's a cremain. I would actually be indicating those and we would flag them, for example. In other words, mark them without touching them, their location, so that we know where they are. And we start from the outside, as I said before, from the areas of lowest concentration, so that we can clear other areas around the scene and then work into where we suspect the highest concentration of the remains may be.
As you are working in, what are what are you doing, if anything, to document what you are finding as you work your way in?
As I work with the ident officers, we everything that's found in order is given an evidence number, and that is controlled by the forensic ident officers. So I will indicate an item, for example, and which is items that is within my area of expertise, in this case, cremated remains. And they will keep an evidence record log and they will say, what description should we give this? And I may say bone fragment or something of that ilk. And it would be photographed and the flag would be remaining there and subsequently mapped into place.
By the time you are getting around to photographing the things that you found, has anything yet been touched physically?
No, nothing is touched until the photography is done. But the mapping may be done a little later because we leave the flags in place.
Well, what goes around comes around. I think this jury has heard about the system of mapping that you have
Sure.
nowadays. Tell us just a little about that.
Well, there's a few different ways to do it. I mean, one way is to superimpose a sort of grid over the scene, which basically looks like a bunch of squares. And then you approach the scene such that you are taking care of the squares around the scene first, clearing those and then going in towards those areas of higher concentration. And that generally is done in order to control the method by which you are processing the scene. There are instances, however, where we'll do a combination of this with an electronic means of documenting a scene. And that's using something known as a total station unit, which is basically a computerized surveyor's unit. And that helps us to generate a computerized map of the scene.
When I say what goes round comes round, we have heard about the total station units already in this trial, but you folks are using that as well.
Oh, yes.
And what specifically are you mapping with that when you use it?
We're mapping sometimes individual fragments, perhaps fragments that are clustered together in a tight grouping in a context. It would be long bones that we would see or other elements of the skeleton, and those are getting numbered as we go along and their position is being noted. This way we get the distribution.
Why note the position of every single fragment that you find?
Well, documentation, it is required for us, first and foremost, for court purposes, in order to document where everything comes from in its original found location. Secondly, by documenting this can tell us all sorts of different things about the circumstances surrounding this find. So what we look for will be bones that happen to be in their relative position to one another, such as the bones of the lower arm being next to one another and being close to or joined up with the bones of the upper arm. We're interested in the position of the body, if that can be ascertained. We are interested in whether the remains have been purposely manipulated, moved, redistributed, crushed actively, mixed up, or commingled. All those things can be ascertained through a proper excavation and recovery technique.
So, with that background, I guess let's get specifically to this case and your role in this case. Are you familiar with a Dr. Leslie Eisenberg?
Yes, I am.
How do you know her, or how have you become familiar with her?
I have known Leslie for must be over 10 years now as colleagues through the American Academy of Forensic Science, the physical anthropology section.
Have you had a chance to review her reports in this case?
Yes, I have.
And some photographs?
Yes.
What can you tell us about the common ground you share with Dr. Eisenberg, the points on which you agree with her work based on the work you have done here?
Oh, I agree with many points of Dr. Eisenberg's research or study on in this case and her report. I certainly have no reason to question the parts of her analysis that deal with the fact that the remains are representative of a single individual who is female, as well as a mature individual that is not a pubescent, if you like, or somebody who is post-pubescent.
Do you have any reason to disagree with Dr. Eisenberg's assessment of the rough age range?
She did note in her report that there was a lack of arthritic changes to the skeleton, and as I recall, to the best of my ability, she was indicating an upper age limit of 30 to 35 years. That can be problematic. I agree that there was no lipping. However, there are.
Stop, time out. That was a technical word.
Pardon me, sorry. There were no arthritic changes, and I certainly agree from what the photos were I saw, I certainly didn't see any. However, she's using that as a basis to say 30 to 35, and I know of no empirical studies to support that. That would be purely speculation.
But you have no reason to doubt it either. I mean, you are not, I take it you don't.
Not one way or another.
Over that?
No.
What else do you find yourself in agreement with?
Specifically, her analysis of the trauma to the head, I'm certainly in agreement with that. She's indicated 2 gunshot wounds, and I'm in agreement with that.
When you say you are in agreement with 2 gunshot wounds, as a forensic anthropologist, are you qualified to say, yeah, I look at that defect in a bone, and in my professional judgment, it's an entrance wound from a bullet?
What we do is we describe the actual characteristics of a specific lesion or discontinuity, if you like, an opening, and we look at the various signatures of that. And in fact, in this case, certainly, they do conform with a high velocity projectile, meaning a bullet.
Do you think, as a forensic anthropologist, that you also, though, could take the next step from gunshot wound to assigning a manner of death or a cause of death?
The problem with that is that with wounds such as this in my profession, we will tend to report that something such as this is perimortem, literally meaning around the time of death. We cannot prove that that was actually the cause of death. We can't prove that it happened shortly after death, or it was a wound that was shortly before death and the person survived for a few minutes and may have been killed through some other means. Because we are dealing with skeletal remains, I do not have the soft tissue that a pathologist does in order to make some of these other determinations. Hence, we usually are stuck with the term perimortem.
Okay, and here, in specific, after your review of the occipital bone fragments and the parietal bone fragments,
Yes,
and the unnatural opening or defect, you are calling it a lesion?
yeah,
Discontinuity, the bullet hole?
yeah,
Okay.
trauma.
Are you able to offer an opinion as a forensic anthropologist on whether those gunshot wounds occurred after the person was dead or before the person was dead?
No, I cannot.
Why not?
Well, the problem is that I just don't know what actually did cause the death. I'm a reasonable person in that, yes, I recognize that gunshot wounds to the head are not conductive of long life. However,
Your Honor, I'm going to interpose an objection at this point. and it may be cleared up with a few more questions from counsel, but I don't think there's been any foundation for this gentleman to render an opinion vis-a-vis the cause of death. Such was not rendered by Dr. Eisenberg either, I might add.
Oh, well, actually, I think we'll step back. I mean,
Sure.
if I wasn't clear about this, I want to be. As a forensic anthropologist, are you professionally qualified to render an opinion on cause of death?
No.
As a forensic anthropologist, are you professionally qualified to render an opinion on manner of death?
No.
Okay. And I guess, if I understand you, what you are saying here is you cannot assign a manner of death within your profession or calling.
No, we cannot. And certainly in my jurisdiction as well. But how we proceed is that I will evaluate trauma, and then this goes to the forensic pathologist as well as the coroner or medical examiner, as the case may be, and they make that final determination.
Now, as a forensic anthropologist and one who's got a strong interest in cremated human remains,
Yes.
can you offer us an opinion on whether a gunshot wound to the head, for example, the two here, were before or after burning of the bones? Is that something you can do?
Yes. Yes, that is something I can do.
And do you agree or disagree with Dr. Eisenberg's conclusion that the gunshot wounds here were before burning of the bones?
Yes, I do agree with that.
Okay, but whether the gunshot wounds were before or after the death of the person on that?
I cannot say.
Okay. Within the field of forensic anthropology, you cannot say that.
That's correct.
Okay. Any other points of agreement with Dr. Eisenberg's work here?
I agree that I agree with her opinion that she was not able to determine the ancestry of the individual or the stature of the individual.
Height.
Yes.
Okay. What did you just looked at photographs, not actual bone fragments, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. What did you see in the condition, the exterior condition of the bone fragments that you saw in photographs?
Well, certainly subjected to an intense heating event, a fire. The types of fractures that I saw there were very consistent with those caused by heat. So you have what we generally refer to as a heat-induced fractures, and there's variety of these.
Tell us about those, a little bit about heat-induced fractures.
Sure. Heat-induced fractures are actually caused during the burning process to any sort of tissue, specifically bone in this case, because when you have a fire, it's actually leaching the water out. So you actually are losing water content. And as a result of that, you get a shrinkage of the bone that's occurring, and then you get a fracturing that occurs as well.
And does it happen in the heating phase or in the cooling phase or just throughout?
Initially, what happens is, as it's being consumed, the bone will heat up, and with anything that does heat up, it expands. It's been found through experimentation that a lot of fracturing does really get undertaken at the cooling stage. So as the bone cools, particularly if it's been in a fire, let's say like a house fire or something like that, and the fire personnel come along and put water on it to cool it fast, that will actually cause it to fracture even more. However, with fires that are attended by a perpetrator, you do get the fracturing taking place naturally. However, the bone will remain in its same location as where it was put with the rest of the body at the time.
We heard testimony from Dr. Eisenberg to the effect that the recovery process here of the human bone fragments she described was well done. I'm not quoting her exactly, but she offered some testimony to that effect. Is that a view with which you can agree?
I'm afraid I have to differ with that opinion.
Why?
Well, from the photographs that I have received, first of all, the documentation with the photography was fairly poor. It was very difficult to tell anything as far as an in situ or the original location.
In situ meaning the original site.
Yes,
As found.
as found would probably be a better way to put it. So the photography was very poor from that perspective. The accounts that I understand occurred as far as the excavation procedures, there was no systematic approach to the collection of the evidence at first processing, from what I saw. I know there was no grid imposed at the time during the initial excavation. I was informed that shovels were used in order to do that, and it wasn't, shall we say, a more forensic archaeological approach, and that essentially Dr. Eisenberg received the materials directly from the police services involved without her having been in the field.
Okay, so other than nitpicking, why does this matter? Why does it matter?
Well, it matters as far as what I mentioned about the documentation and being able to tell things about the circumstances surrounding burning of the body. One of the things that context can tell you, if it's well done, is to approach the question of where the body was burned. Was it moved? Was this the actual location or not?
How do you approach drawing a conclusion about where the original burn site or where the body was burned? How do you approach that through a proper recovery?
Well, within the recovery, and certainly in recoveries I've been involved with, what is done is as you proceed through the careful excavation, removing soil is removed from a particular square, for example, that you have identified as being of interest within your grid. And you proceed vertically from the highest point of that square down to the level until you start finding material. When you find that material, you clear it off very carefully. You actually switch from, shall we say, a trowel type implement to actually wooden implements because they have the same approximate density as bone and even cremated bones. So you have less risk of actually causing damage, shall we say, extra damage to the remains.
Why is that a concern, by the way, with burnt bone?
Well, burnt bone is extremely fragile. We tend to have a little axiom that we refer to it in teaching cremation studies to students. That is, if you take a cremated bone and you pick up one bone, you end up putting down 10. What that means is that is very fragile and it can quite often, when moved, unless it's been, shall we say, fixed together in some fashion using a glue or something of that ilk, you're actually going to pick it up and you're going to cause some damage.
Now, is that breakage or that fragility universally true through all the stages of from, light charring to a complete calcination of the bone?
No, it's because a body burns what we call differentially. In other words, it doesn't burn evenly. You actually have some areas of the skeleton that are going to burn, or the body that will burn more quickly. If you think about it, areas where there's not a lot of skin coverage, such as the ends of fingers, the top of the head, these sorts of areas will burn more quickly. So we'll actually see them go through the various different color changes and stages of the fire process ahead of other areas such as the torso. More meat on the torso, certainly mine. And that's going to take longer to actually be consumed as opposed to, say, the limbs or the head of the face and such.
But I'm curious, does the actual fragility, if you will, of the bone?
Yes, it's going to vary as a result of that. So the earlier on, where you have the dark blackened, if you like, charring of the bone, is not as fragile as the bone that has gone to sort of gray blue stage and approaching what we call a calcine stage. The actual end stage, if you like, the ultimate extreme of burning bone is where we have the white calcine stage. And in fact, the molecules of the minerals in the bone actually reorient themselves into the structure that is more akin to porcelain. So it actually becomes quite strong at that point.
Okay, so it's going through sort of a curve where it's becoming more and more fragile. And at the final stage, you were saying it's actually regain.
It can be.
Some strength.
It's very much dependent upon the actual density of the bone.
Okay, all right. And you were explaining how this, this sort of layered excavation and identifying pieces in place
Yes.
helps you to be helps get you to being able to draw a conclusion about whether the body was burned there or moved or, otherwise disturbed. And I want to go back to that.
Sure. The actual, when we actually do an excavation like this, and let's say we come across, as I have, I will describe an actual scene I have been involved with, the lower end of the upper arm bone. Upon excavation, by excavating it carefully, one can see the actual lines of the fracture from the heat and see that, yes, this bone is in a location. However, if we move this bone, it's going to fall apart. That tells us that this bone is the original context of where that was burned, because if we moved it, we would already find it in the smaller pieces.
Okay, all right.
Quite logically, if you have got something that, it's akin to taking a piece of glass and putting it on the floor and stepping on it. Well, you can see the outline of the glass and the size of the piece of glass, but you will also see all the cracks. So if you move it, you're not going to be able to see that outline anymore in its original form.
Okay. Do you agree here with Dr. Eisenberg that it's clear in this case that bones were moved?
I agree that bones were moved.
In the human, when I say bones, I'm talking about human
remains.
Human remains.
Yes.
Okay. You do agree with that?
I do.
Okay. And based on the recovery method that was used here, are you able to offer an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty about where these human remains were burned?
No, I'm not.
Why not?
Well, the fact is that because I don't have any records from which to examine that would actually indicate to me that there are bones in the original location where they were burned, I can't offer an opinion on that.
If you go to a site and you have the opportunity to recover a burnt human remains, are you able to identify the specific bones by name and location in the body when you are looking at them in place?
Yes.
How is that?
Well, there are anatomical landmarks on the various different bones. And if they are in their original location where they were burned, we'll even see them on what we call relative anatomical position. So that if you burn remains in a specific locations and no other force acts upon them except the actual burning process, then the materials that make up their head will be at the head end of the body, and you will have the neck, the thorax, and then the legs, and then the arms off of to the side. So that makes logical sense.
How about when these things are fractured? Because I gather from what you said a few minutes ago, some breakage and fracturing will occur just because of the heating and initial contraction as the bone dries?
Yeah, the heat actually will definitely cause fracturing, and you will see all sorts of different types of fractures within the bone itself.
And but you're still able, if the bones are in place, to identify the type of bone you are looking at.
Oh, yes.
And that's something a forensic anthropologist can do with training?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Back to the moving of bones now. When you say you agree that human remains were moved here, are you talking about moved a little bit within one site, or moved from point A to point B, or both?
Given that there are 3 locations, from my understanding, where we have bone having been documented to have come from, then we're talking of point A to B or to C, as the case may be.
Okay. Now, we have been calling these the area behind Steve and Avery's garage, or sometimes called it the burn area.
Yes.
The Yander burn barrel, is that?
Yes.
The second. And then there's what I call, at least, the quarry pile or quarry site.
Yes.
On that, Dr. Eisenberg testified, as I recall, that she only suspected that she was seeing human bone fragments, maybe 2 from the pelvis, 1 from the iliac crest, and that there were other bones that she initially suspected to be human, some of which she later determined were animal
Yes.
bone, and some of which remain undetermined, still possibly human and possibly not.
Yes, that's my understanding.
Do you have any reason to disagree with that?
No, I do not.
Okay, so, but as I understand it, in your opinion, human bone fragments were found in the Yander burn barrel,
Yes, that's my understanding from the report.
and human bone fragments behind Mr. Avery's garage.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so at least those 2 sites, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, in your opinion, you got human bone.
Yes, I take Dr. Eisenberg at her word.
Okay, and again, I think we touched on this, but do you see any evidence in your independent review that we have the remains of more than one person?
No, it is consistent from the inventory that she provided in her report. It's consistent with one individual.
Are you able to say anything about whether bone fragments in the area behind the garage were or were not moved, disturbed, or the verb was you used in that general area behind Mr. Avery's garage?
Based on the recovery techniques, I have no evidence or any documentation to be able to make any determination.
Well, can you agree with Dr. Eisenberg's opinion, as I recall it, that probably the area behind Mr. Avery's garage was the original burn site for the bone fragments wherever found?
I cannot agree with that at this point.
Why not?
Well, because firstly, the documentation. The documentation itself did not lend itself to that interpretation, so I can make no inference whatsoever from that.
Okay. Well, let's go to the reasons that Dr. Eisenberg gave in support of her view. She told us that the greater amount by far of human bone or human remains was found behind the garage, with much less found in the Yander burn barrel, and still much less, if it was human at all, at the quarry site.
Yes, that's what I understand.
Does that, in your professional opinion, support the view that therefore the Avery garage was the most likely burn site?
No.
Why not?
I have been involved in cases where human remains have been burned in one location and moved to another location. And in those cases, in fact, the actual location where the bones have been moved to, in other words, their ultimate location of where they have been buried or placed in another context, tends to be the location where most of the remains are. And in that instance, for example, I have recovered elements of or parts of the skeleton from all areas of the body.
Okay, wait a minute, I want to stop you.
Sure.
Are you saying that in your experience, when burnt bones are moved, you tend to find the majority of them away from the place in which they were burned? In other words, find them in the place to which they were moved, not from which they were moved?
Objection, leading.
I want to make sure I understood your testimony.
I'm going to allow it.
I understand that from your question, the answer is yes. In the cases I have dealt with where human remains have been moved, the majority of them have been from the body and making up the largest portion of the body from the ultimate final place where they were actually moved to.
When you had those situations, how have you been able to determine that?
As far as the numbers or...
No, that the bones were moved to this place.
Well, we have found small fragments in some in situ, or shall we say the original location of the burn, determined by the excavation techniques I have told you about where items have been missed. And then all the other items have been taken and moved.
Well, and this brings me back to Dr. Eisenberg, because it's, as I recall, the second point she made in support of the conclusion that the area behind the garage was the probable burn site is that that's where she found the smaller, more delicate bones, facial bones, dental structures, that kind of thing. Does finding the smaller and more delicate bone fragments support the conclusion, in your experience, that this must be the place where the original burn occurred?
No, it does not.
Why not?
Well, we have actually been able to recover fragmentary teeth, facial bones, very small bones from the body, including even we found bones from the middle ear, which are about 1 millimeter in size, in one of those locations where the bones have been moved to.
In other words, they have survived. Some of these small bones have survived moving
Yes, they have.
and then identifiable in another place.
Yes, that's correct.
Say the bones in the middle ear.
Yes,
How many of these bones are there?
3 in each middle ear,
1 millimeter each?
approximately, yeah.
Okay. Well, and I think the third thing, as I recall Dr. Eisenberg's testimony, which she cited in support of her opinion that the area behind the garage was the probable burn site, is that it looked like there had been only one burn event. That there had been only one fire. Do you follow what I'm saying? Everything had been burned in one place?
Yes.
Does that support the opinion that the Avery garage was the probable site?
Not necessarily. As a result, one cannot tell how many burns actually took place in that location. From my own experience, I have actually dealt with cremation cases where somebody has actually used a traditional burn area in their own yard for the location of a burn itself. So if there's a fire pit that's at hand, then that's where it's been.
Well, but I guess I'm talking about cases in which we're agreed that bones have been moved
Yes,
after burning.
yes, that is in fact the case. Yes. We do have instances where there can be even reburning going on and certainly burns going on before that. So you can't tell how many burn events took place. That's the bottom line.
Okay. Can you give us an opinion about where the original burn site was for the human remains eventually given to Dr. Eisenberg?
No, I cannot. Not from the evidence that I have reviewed.
Can you rule out the area behind the Avery garage?
The way I would phrase it is I fail to exclude it.
So, in other words, it's a possible place.
Certainly.
Okay.
Certainly.
Based on the information you have, were there other possible burn sites, let's say, on the larger Avery property?
Oh, certainly, yes.
Such as?
The barrel, for one, I can't rule that out. My understanding from the scene of the actual overall property that there is a wood type of furnace, I understand, on the property. And there's even, as I recall, an aluminum smelter on the property.
Okay. Now, you personally haven't looked at any of these?
I have not examined any of these. I have never been to the Avery property.
All right. Let alone in November of 2005?
Not at all.
Okay. And what can you say about other unknown possible burn sites here?
Well, I can't exclude any other locations as being impossible because simply I have no evidence to that effect.
Well, let's go back.
Your Honor, may counsel and I approach the bench?
Sure. Members of the jury, we're going to take a short break at this time. I remind you not to discuss the case during the break. You are excused at this time. And Dr. FAIRGRIEVE, I will have you step out in the hallway at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Please be seated. I will indicate for the record that Attorney Fallon asked for a sidebar and raised an issue which I suggested be raised on the record outside the presence of a jury. At this time, the jury has been excused and the witness is also excused from the courtroom. Mr. Fallon.
Yes, thank you, Judge. I just wanted to express concern. I don't know where counsel is going with the rest of this examination on this point, but for my review of the amended disclosure of the expert witness, Scott FAIRGRIEVE, the amended disclosure states at the bottom of the page for, most notably, the first full sentence on page 5, that there be no opinion expressed that there was no evidence that these cremains were originally burned in the barrel where they were found. So the testimony, as elicited by Dr. FAIRGRIEVE, it's not the opinion that we were led to believe would be expressed. And again, This is one of the reasons we filed our demand for a disclosure. Full disclosure in a report, fear that such an opinion like this would be expressed without notice to the state.
Mr. Strang.
Yes, and I understand the confusion which I probably created in the summary here, or maybe here, although I don't think he's offered any opinion that bones were burned in the burn barrel. What this is meant to say, and what I will assure counsel and the court, is that Dr. Fairgrieve is I expect him to say that I have no evidence that allows me to conclude where these bones were burned. I can't say they were burned in the burn barrel. I can't say they were burned behind the garage. I can't say they were burned anywhere else. In other words, I can't assign a place, nor can I necessarily rule out possible burn sites. So I do understand the concern because the specific sentence says there is no evidence that these cremains were originally burned in the barrel where they were found. And that is his opinion in the sense that I can't say they were burned there. I don't have evidence that the body was burned in the barrel. What I expect him to say is, I can't rule out, or I fail to exclude any possible burn sites. We'll just never know, is the bottom line.
That's an entirely different, well, not entirely different, but it's clearly a different opinion. He's saying here that they were not burned in the burn barrel. That's what we expected him to say. Now he's saying, I can't rule it out.
It doesn't say that. I mean, I understand the confusion and
Well, there is a difference between saying, I can't rule out the burn barrel, and saying there's no evidence to suggest that they were burned in the burn barrel. Perhaps that's something the state can bring up in cross-examination. Did the report come from the doctor, or...
No, it's from counsel. There is no report. That's our problem.
This is the disclosure that we filed with potential expert witnesses. The broader opinion here is that he may agree with, challenge, or differ with any of the opinions offered by the state's expert forensic anthropologist, and more particularly, I'm quoting from page 3 of the disclosure, Dr. Fairgrieve may testify that while it is possible that the cremains found were originally burned in the pit behind Stephen Avery's garage, in his opinion, it was also possible that they were burned in another location. He goes on to mention the smelter and the wood furnace, and in his opinion, it is possible that the cremains were rendered at either of those locations or another undetermined location. And that is the intended scope of the testimony.
Well, taking what you just read, together with what Mr. Fallon just read, I would interpret that to mean they could have been burned in another location besides behind the garage. They could have been burned in the smelter, or whatever. The other reference was, but I would have interpreted it as excluding the burn barrel.
No, he won't say that. He's saying I can't exclude it, but neither do I have any evidence that they were burned in the burn barrel.
Well, I guess I disagree. I think the opinion should be excluded. The language that he read is helpful on the one hand, but not helpful on the other. Insofar as we fully expected Dr. Fairgrieve to refute some, none, or all the opinions expressed in Dr. Eisenberg's report. That's certainly fair game, and I don't have any problem with that. But then to try to say he may offer some other opinions about some other stuff to which we're not privy yet, that creates the whole problem of not having a report in the first place from which to base a cross-examination upon. So I understand counsel's point, but I don't know how you get around the fact that he's saying it wasn't in the burn barrel. So that leaves us the burn pit, the smelter, the boiler, or some other place, God knows where. But it certainly doesn't include the barrel.
No, what he's saying is, I have no evidence that they were burned in the barrel. I can't rule it out, but I have no evidence that it happened.
All right.
And it might be helpful too if we could go back with the court reporter and find out just exactly where we were when we stopped.
Before we do that, I'm going to rule as follows. I believe the information was slightly misleading, but not so much that I am going to grant a remedy to prevent this witness from giving the testimony he did. This is, there is not a significant difference between saying there's no evidence to suggest it was burned in the barrel and based on the evidence available, essentially, I have no idea where it was burned. I understand what you're saying, Mr. Fallon. I think there is somewhat of a difference, but I'm going to rule that it's not enough of a difference to impose a sanction on the defence.
Very well. Thank you.
And I do want to go back so that I really can try to steer away from any problem I created.
Alright, let's go off the record for a couple of minutes before we bring the jurors back in. Alright, we'll bring the jury back in at this time. You may be seated and Mr. Strang, you may resume.
Thank you. Dr. Fairgrieve, within the field of forensic anthropology and drawing on your experience with cremated human remains, are you able to offer an opinion to any reasonable degree of scientific certainty about whether the remains found here were burned in the area behind Mr. Avery's garage?
No, I am not.
Are you able to offer an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that the remains here were burned in any other particular location?
No, I'm not.
On the evidence you have, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, are you able to rule out any possible burn sites?
No, I am not.
Are you able to say that, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, human bones here were moved or remains were moved after burning?
Yes.
What is your opinion on that?
Well, the fact that we have burned bones in at least two locations, logically, they have been moved.
Are you able to offer an opinion about the means by which those were moved or the mode of transport?
No, I'm not.
Of the bones? Are you able to rule anything out in that respect?
No, I'm not.
And in your professional experience, what significance, if any, do you assign to the majority of bone fragments being found behind Mr. Avery's garage?
Just the fact that the majority of the bones representing the individual are in that position.
And in your experience, is that more consistent with being a place that bones were moved to or bones were removed from?
To.
What, if any, significance do you assign to the fact that somewhat larger bone fragments, in general or on average, may have been found in the underburn barrel than on average were found behind the Avery garage?
I don't really attach any significance to that other than an incomplete movement.
Why not?
Well, the fact that things do get left behind, I don't know the motivation as far as what's been going on behind the actual movement of these remains. And so why they are in one place and not completely moved to another is beyond my understanding.
Okay. And how about size, the relative size of the fragments? Does that tell you anything about movement or why these things were found, where they were found?
Not specifically, no.
Is it sometimes difficult in the field at a burn site to identify cremated human remains, to the naked eye?
To the trained eye, we do recognize specific human elements, and it is possible, but it always depends on what is present at the scene.
And I'm not sure. I want to chase that just a little bit. I mean, with burnt remains, is it always obvious to the untrained eye what one is looking at?
No.
Why not?
Well, in order to be able to recognize human remains, you're going to have some fairly advanced training in the anatomy of the human skeleton and what bones look like. And also what specifically human bones look like, because people will burn garbage outside and there will be remnants from meals and things like that, and being able to distinguish animal from human, so that does take training.
Did you see any differences that struck you in your experience as significant in the range of heat damage to the bones found at either of the 2 or possibly 3 locations?
From what I recall, the bones from the pit area, as I recall, seem to be more calcined, that is, towards the white stage. And I believe there was a higher preponderance of charred remains from burn barrel.
And which, if either, would be more easily identified to the untrained eye as being human bone?
Oh, the charred remains, the ones that are white charred.
More easy by colour or appearance than the
Form.
I'm sorry?
Due to its form, shape.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you.
Mr. Fallon.
Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
Welcome to Wisconsin.
Thank you.
Is this your first trip?
No, I have been to Wisconsin before.
You have, but this is the first time you have been asked to be a witness in a case, I take it.
That is correct.
All right. And this is the first time you have been here with respect to this case.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Now, I take it from your experience and training and more importantly, your resume and your work for the Crown, it looks like you have done a fair amount of forensic work.
Yes.
And I take it that you're routinely asked to go to what are suspected crime scenes and assist law enforcement in the processing of those?
That is correct.
All right. And you've been doing that for about 15 years?
16.
16 years.
16, yes.
All right. And I take it in the province of Ontario, you've provided expert testimony on a number of occasions?
That is correct.
And frequently, if not almost in all cases, as I understood it, you provided testimony for the Crown or for the prosecution?
All cases.
All right. Okay, for this case, help us out here and tell us what information you had to assist you in expressing the opinions you have expressed this afternoon.
I received photographic files in the form of CDs. I received reports that were, shall I say, compiled by Dr. Eisenberg.
All right.
I have received a transcript of testimony of Dr. Eisenberg's from, I believe it was a preliminary hearing, and I received background from the defense concerning the circumstances surrounding the case.
Background from the defense?
Yes.
All right. We'll get to that in a minute. So that I'm clear in terms of the documents you had for the purposes of expressing the opinion today, you had the preliminary and final report of Dr. Eisenberg?
Correct.
You had a copy of her testimony from the preliminary examination in this case, which is now about 14 months ago, I guess.
Let's just take one moment at sidebar, counsel, and Your Honour, if we may.
Members of the jury, I'm going to excuse you for a much shorter period than the shorter period I just excused you for a few minutes ago. You're excused at this time. You may be seated. Mr. Strang.
I think probably the best way to spend the time is just to go off the record, and counsel can try to work out here where he's going and how we get there without, going into inadmissible material.
Go ahead. We'll go off the record for a minute. Alright, counsel, before I bring the jury back, since we did have a sidebar, I will leave it to one of the two of you to put something on the record concerning the contact.
I interrupted Mr. Fallon's cross-examination to suggest a sidebar because, although I thought his questions proper in the proper area, I recognised that we might be getting into a situation where the witness, quite honestly, would respond by referring to information attributed to Brendan Dassey or from Brendan Dassey's case, some of which was shared with the witness. I didn't think that's where Mr. Fallon meant to be going, and I just didn't want, to have an honest answer to an unintended question and create a problem. So that was the reason for the sidebar and what we discussed briefly at sidebar.
Alright.
That's accurate. All I wanted to know was the base of information upon which he was operating. And I'm comfortable with his not mentioning whatever information they obtained from him because it's not germane to the rest of my examination.
Very well. We'll bring the jurors back in at this time. You may be seated, and Mr. Fallon, you may resume.
Thank you. Doctor, as I understand when we left off, you were telling us about the information that you had at your disposal to assist you in expressing these opinions this afternoon. So let me begin by saying and summarizing, you had 2 reports from Dr. Rosenberg,
That's correct.
a copy of her transcript from the preliminary examination.
That is correct.
Okay. You had a CD-ROM of the, I would imagine, a fairly numerous amount of photographs taken just by Dr. Rosenberg of all the bone fragments that she examined?
Yes.
Maybe not all, but quite a sizable amount of them anyway.
Yes, that's correct.
All right. And you also examined a few pages of the police reports, as I understand it.
That is correct, yes.
Now, the police reports you examined, were they reports authored by an agent from the Division of Criminal Investigation by the name of Tom Sturtevant?
I believe so.
All right. And there were about 4 pages?
I don't recall the number of pages.
But it would be been about in the initial discovery, the reports, that they were brief reports from the officer regarding the initial discovery?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. Now, any other police reports?
I can't think of any offhand.
All right. Other than the photographs of the bone fragments made by Dr. Rosenberg, did you obtain any of the crime scene photographs?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Tell us about the crime scene photographs that you received.
Various views of the Avery property.
Aerial views?
Aerial views.
Okay.
Landscape views, so down, obviously taken by somebody on the ground, various different angles, exterior views of dwellings, distant views of the pit behind the garage, general area photos as well.
All right. How about any of the photographs obtained prior to the processing of the pit developed by the Wisconsin State Patrol on Sunday or Monday? That would be November 6th or 7th, the days before the pit was discovered on the 8th.
I believe there were some, as I recall.
Some?
Yeah, I'm trying to picture the images in my mind, but I do believe I received those.
Did you receive any photographs regarding the processing of the pit by Special Agents Pivito, Tyler, and Rent occurring on Thursday the 10th?
Not to my recollection.
Okay, so you did not see any photographs showing the pit covered up on in a blue tarp?
I do recall a photograph with a blue tarp over it.
A blue tarp over it. How many of those photographs do you recall? There were 3 rolls of prints.
I can't recall specifically.
All right. Counsel has provided me with some information, so let's take a look. If I may approach the witness, Judge?
Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm showing what has been marked as, at least on the information provided by counsel, as roll 4. Does that look like a series of photographs that you're familiar with?
Yes, it does. Yes.
Great. All right. How about another stack of photographs? Looks like D16, 1 through 23. Take a quick look at those.
Yes, I do recall these.
Okay, great. And D14, 1 through 28?
I recall some of the photos within this.
Some, but you did not see all of them?
I cannot state with any certainty that I recall seeing all of them.
One last look here, if you'll be so kind. D15, 1 through 24.
Yes, I do recall these.
All right. And you have seen these photographs?
Yes, I do recall those.
As well as the photographs provided to you that were taken by Dr. Rosenberg?
Yes.
Okay. Any other law enforcement reports did you have the opportunity to examine?
There was a compiled report that was a computerized simulation of the scene.
All right.
And I did have access to that document in computerized form.
That would have been an overview animation by Trooper Ralston.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, with respect to the photographs that you have seen there, did you have all the reports which were generated in conjunction with those photographs?
I don't know for a certainty that I had all reports.
All right. Do you know what day those photographs were taken from the information that you were provided?
I don't recall.
All right. When were you first asked to assist in reviewing this information on behalf of the defense?
I believe it was early November of 2006.
All right.
If I recall.
And in this particular case, you did not issue a report of your findings, correct?
No, I did not.
You were not asked to write one, I take it.
That's correct.
All right. In the cases that you have testified for the Crown, you usually write a report, do you not?
I do.
As a matter of fact, I suspect that's probably required.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And that's so that when the gentleman who happens to be on the other side of the prosecution by the Crown, so that they would have a fair notice of exactly what the opinions you were going to express so they would know what they were.
Yes.
Okay. By the way, while we're at that, when you work for the Crown, generally you have access to all the information that the officers generate to assist you in formulating the opinions that go into that report. Is that right?
I do have access, yes.
And I would hazard a guess that it's probably pretty routine practice that you would review all that information before putting your report together as a consulting forensic anthropologist.
Correct.
And that is because forensic means of, by, or pertaining to a court. That's right?
A legal context.
Right. So, in other words, it's taking your field of biological anthropology and your specialty and kind of merging these principles with the principles of the law, formulate an opinion and express it in a court of law.
Yes.
Okay, very good. Let's talk a little bit about your experience, a little more detail. You would agree, would you not, that no two crime scenes are alike?
I would indeed.
As a matter of fact, each crime scene presents a host of different issues and problems that need to be addressed and resolved by those investigating what's before them.
Yes.
And as such, there is a certain amount of professional judgment that needs to be exercised to perform your duties, which takes into account these varying conditions.
Yes.
And while you may have standard operating practice or procedures, sometimes that procedure has to be modified from time to time, given whatever you find at a location.
I would accept that.
In fact, not every location can be processed with a grid format or forensic mapping format, can they?
I don't know if that's true.
Well, have you been to any disaster locations or sites?
Yes.
Not all of them are forensically mapped or gridded, are they?
The ones I have been involved with, they have had a form of grid put in.
But you can't say that necessarily occurs in all cases.
No, I cannot state that. That's correct.
All right. And there may very well be good reason to depart from the standard protocol and procedures when processing a scene.
I would accept that.
And I would imagine in your neck of the woods in Northern Ontario, weather is a pretty important factor in processing scenes, especially this time of year.
Absolutely.
That might be one of the reasons that you might depart from a certain set of procedures to account for that.
I have yet to do so. I have done winter recoveries in cremain cases and have not deviated from the protocols that I have been using. Ha.
But you can't imagine a situation where that is likely to occur?
I suppose.
Sure. All right. I would like to talk a little bit about fires. In your work, as I understand it, and maybe this is a good way to get into it, you specialize in studying cremations.
Cremated remains.
Cremated remains. Now, are those cremated remains, are those the kind that we're talking about in crematoriums, or do you use the word cremated remains in a more natural consequence?
A more natural consequence.
All right.
Not commercial cremations.
Not commercial cremations. Are you familiar with commercial cremations?
Yes, I am.
All right. And while we're at it, that, would it be fair to say that it takes about 3 million BTUs to cremate a human body?
3 million?
Yeah.
I wouldn't know that specifically.
You wouldn't know?
My knowledge is with time and temperature.
Time and temperature.
Correct.
All right. Then the average temperature to cremate remains varies somewhere between 1600 and 1800 degrees, anywhere from an hour and a half to 2 hours. Does that sound about right?
I take it the degrees are in Fahrenheit?
Correct.
Yes, that would be correct.
That's right. I forgot. You guys use Celsius.
Right.
You're not going to make me convert centigrade to Fahrenheit, are you?
That's...
Because I'm a lawyer, I can't do that.
I will do my best to convert my numbers.
We might need a translator yet. All right. And while we're at it, a BTU is a British thermal unit.
Yes.
And would you accept the general proposition that 1 BTU is the amount of energy to raise the temperature of water 1 degree from 59.5 degrees Fahrenheit to about 60.5 degrees Fahrenheit?
I believe that's the definition.
All right. And actually,
We would need a volume of water for BTU.
liter of water, excuse me, you're right.
Yes.
And BTU is a means of measuring energy, right?
Yes, it is.
All right. Now, when you're looking at a cremated remains in nature, one of the things that you would ask yourself as a forensic anthropologist, you would want to know what the fuel load was. You might be interested in how much fire was created.
The type of fuel, yes.
Right. And we have at least 4 basic types of fuel, do we not? We have a liquid form of fuel.
Yes, liquid, solids,
We have solids.
gaseous.
We have gas or vapor,
Yes.
and we have aerosols and even dust.
Yes,
Right?
that's correct.
In fact, some powders, even wheat flour, can somehow be exploded.
Yes,
Okay, you would agree that in terms of determining the probability of burning human remains at nature depends in large part on the fuel load and, more importantly, the exposure of the body to the heat itself.
that's correct.
As a matter of fact, in terms of the exposure of the body to heat, the more surface area which is exposed to the heat, the quicker and faster the remains will reach that cremated state, correct?
That is correct.
The bottom line is, whenever you're looking at that, what you want to try to do is to assess is how long the parts of the body were exposed to certain temperature.
Yes,
All right. And it's not so much the flame, by the way, that we're worried about. It's the exposure to the heat
yes,
generated by the flame.
yes,
Now, we have a variety of solid fuels that are commonly used to burn. Most notably, wood seems to be the most common, correct?
certainly.
All right. And would you disagree with me if I were to tell you that per pound of wood would generate about 5,000 BTUs?
I have no basis to disagree with that.
All right. And that a pound of coal would generate roughly 12,000 BTUs,
That sounds about right.
and oil would be about 16,000 BTUs.
Yeah, 16, yeah.
All right. Now, one of the things that would be used for fuel would be a tire, correct?
Absolutely.
And as a matter of fact, a tire generates anywhere from about 14,000 BTU to 16,000 BTU per passenger tire.
Yes,
And it's 14 to 16 because if you shred a tire, you're likely to end up with about 16,000 BTUs of energy per pound of tire.
that would be right.
And the reason that happens is because there's more surface area of the tire which is exposed, thus generating more heat.
Precisely.
The average passenger tire is about 20 pounds, right?
Thereabouts, yeah, I would agree.
All right. So then the average passenger tire would generate anywhere from about 280,000 to 300,000 BTUs of energy.
I would accept that.
And tires are a pretty good source of fuel because they burn consistently and they burn very hot.
Oh, yes,
They generate a great deal of heat.
I agree.
And as a matter of fact, you would expect to see a very large flame pile from one burning tires, correct?
Flame pile?
Flame, a high flame.
Oh, a high flame, yes.
All right. And they would generate a great deal of heat.
Yes,
Okay. Now, before a body can be cremated, whether it's in a crematorium or in the wild, as it were, the body first has to be heated to a significant degree of temperature, correct?
yes, that would be correct.
All right. As a matter of fact, you have to, for all intents and purposes, you have to dehydrate that body first.
The process begins with obviously the exterior of the body, and heating things such as hair, for example, would be the first area that is lost if there is no clothing.
And as you heat the body, it begins to dehydrate. And after a particular point in time, the body itself, the remains become actually more fuel for the fire.
Once you get through the skin, it becomes more fuel. The fats of the body do serve as a fuel for the fire. That is correct.
As a matter of fact, back in the days in antiquity, when they had funeral pyres, they would often smear bodies with animal fat to assist in the creating a funeral pyre.
In order to get the ignition, yes.
Now, what time do you want to take a break?
If you're at a logical break in the questioning, I think that's a good idea.
Sure.
Alright, members of the jury, we're going to take an afternoon break at this time. I will remind you not to discuss the case during the break. You are excused at this time. You may be seated. Counsel, I would like to see you briefly in chambers, now at the start of the break.
Okay.
Mr. Fallon, you may resume.
Thank you, Judge. Doctor, I would like to finish up our discussion of the burning human remains in the natural setting. You would agree, would you not, that there are several variables that are at play in trying to decide how a body was burned and how long it would have taken and things of that nature, correct?
Yes, I would agree.
All right. For instance, you would want to know the type and amount of the fuel.
Yes, that would be important.
And you would certainly want to know what the weather conditions were, correct?
That would have an influence.
That would have an influence. You would want to certainly know what the ratio is of the fuel mixture to the, what is the term, being burned?
If possible.
And very importantly, you would want to know the extent to which a body was exposed to heat generated by the fuel.
Yes.
Now, you would agree, would you not, that an unattended, or we will use the term funeral pyre.
All right.
Given all the other variables being the same, but an unattended funeral pyre would burn at a slower rate than an attended one.
In general, yes.
Because one, an unattended one, presumably the person who is conducting the fire or managing the fire, that's probably a better word, would be able to make sure that fuel load is adequately distributed to all parts of the fire.
Yes.
All right. And as a matter of fact, if the attending person wanted to make sure that the human remains were fully exposed to the heat, there may be some dismembering, correct?
Dismembering in what sense?
Well, if you were to, let's put it in the right table, if you were to chop up human remains, there would be more surface area exposed to the heat.
Yes, I would accept that.
All right. And as a matter of fact, if that was occurring, then the remains would be consumed more quickly than if you just had left a body in toto laying on a funeral pyre.
Yes, I would agree.
All right. I want to go back and visit the testimony that you discussed with counsel regarding the burn pit as being the potential or possible area of initial or original burn, and talk also about the impact or no impact of the burn barrel.
Okay.
Just so we're oriented.
Sure.
Perhaps the best place to begin is, I think we have an agreement for the minutest form of human bone, which has been subjected to a great deal of heat, professional training, in all likelihood, would be required to identify those items.
I would agree.
In fact, there are certain bits of human remains which are so small that could actually be the quarter or 1/4 of a fingernail, not just be that much of a sliver of a bone. That could be that remains are present for.
Yes.
And to the average person, that includes all of us here, with the exception of yourself, I would imagine the chances of us being able to recognize an item that small as part of the human anatomy are about slim to none.
That sounds reasonable.
And are you aware that the vast majority of human remains, fragmented human remains of that size, were recovered from the burn pit area, correct?
Yes.
And are you also aware, are you not, that the various articles of clothing were recovered from that burn pit as well, correct?
Yes. Yes.
All right. And you are aware that there were some rivets that looked like they went to a pair of blue jeans?
Yes.
A zipper?
Yes.
All right. And all those were recovered from the burn pit and from no other location that you're aware of?
To my knowledge, that's correct.
All right. And just so that I'm clear, it's your understanding that clearly some bones had to have been moved because we have human remains not only in the burn pit, but we have them in this burn barrel a couple of 100 feet away.
Yes.
All right. So you would agree that the only real explanation for that to have happened is human agency.
I would agree.
In other words, a person had to have taken them from one place and put them in another.
Yes.
And in terms of the burn barrel, you were aware that there was no articles of clothing found from that particular burn barrel. There were no rivets.
That's my understanding.
No grommets from shoes.
That's correct.
No zippers.
That's correct.
And most of the bone fragments of Well, they were of a larger variety than those recovered from the pit itself,
Yes,
right?
right.
Okay. Now, one thing, if you could clear up for me, I'm not sure. Did you say that the bones in the barrel had a greater degree of burn defect, or was it that the burns in the pit? Which is it?
I believe it was the burns. The bones in the pit appear to have a longer stage, shall we say.
A longer exposure, as it were, to the heat.
Yes.
In other words, they showed greater fragmentation.
Great heat condition, damage, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Which may very well account for the fact that we have all the really microscopic and very, very small fragment of bone recovered from the pit. That would certainly be consistent, right?
I can't deny that.
Okay. Now, as I understand your testimony, it's clear to you that the remains that were recovered here, most of which came from the burn pit, are the remains of an adult female.
Yes.
And you do not take any issue with the fact that there is a clear evidence of at least 2 gunshots to the cranial pieces, which were able to be recovered.
That's correct.
And you would agree, would you not, that they are entrance defects, correct?
Yes.
And that's because the beveling, which is the present, is on the outside of in other words, the entrance area, correct?
No, that is not correct.
It's on the inside?
It's on the inside.
And if there were exit wounds, where would the beveling be?
On the exterior.
On the exterior?
Right.
And in your opinion, well, let's digress momentarily. You had some question regarding the cause of death and manner of death. The only matter at issue here is manner of death. Now, in the remains that you observed here, you would agree, would you not, doctor, that there would be no point in attempting an autopsy?
Not in the traditional sense, no.
There's certainly not enough tissue. In fact, there's no tissue left to examine.
I understood there to be some tissue recovered.
Some tissue?
Some tissue, however charred.
However charred, which some DNA analysis was undertaken. Are you aware of that?
Yes, that's my understanding.
But by and large, that's really the only piece of muscle tissue that was recovered.
Yes.
And that alone certainly would not be enough for one to conduct an autopsy in the traditional sense, correct?
That is correct.
All right. And would you agree, as an anthropologist, whether you have an archaeological perspective or even a biological perspective, that examining bone and the condition in which these were found is, in large part, almost strictly in the purview of a forensic anthropologist?
We're best to quantify and examine the remains, certainly for the traditional areas that forensic anthropology deals with.
And you certainly wouldn't disagree with the fact that what you have is an individual who was murdered, would you?
I don't know that to be true or not.
Well, you wouldn't disagree with that as a logical conclusion to be drawn from the evidence provided, would you? I mean, she didn't jump into the fire herself.
No, I would agree with that.
And certainly she didn't shoot herself in the head twice, right? That would be pretty hard to do.
It may surprise you to know that I know that it's been done, but...
How many times have you seen it done, Doc?
1.
All right. Out of how many thousands of cases?
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Now, you can't say to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that the burn pit was not the original place of the burning, can you?
That's correct.
I would like you to tell me just what evidence you have that the body could have been burned in the burn barrel.
I have none to support it.
Absolutely none, right?
That's correct.
In fact, the greater weight of the evidence which is presented to you would show that the barrel, in all likelihood, was not the location of the original burning.
I can't say one or the other.
Well, the typical 55-gallon drum, in which certainly would be difficult to put an adult female of approximately 5 foot 8 inches in stature, stuff her into a barrel and burn her, that wouldn't be the easiest of things to do, right?
I wouldn't imagine it would be easy, no.
And as a matter of fact, you would have to agree, it would take far longer time to actually reduce a human being to to the level of which you found the bone in a burn pit? It would take a lot longer to do that in a burn barrel.
Not necessarily.
There's not enough exposure. You'd have to expose that body to a great deal of heat, correct?
You would, yes.
All right. And would it be certainly really difficult to put in a lot of tires and high burning accelerants in that particular barrel, correct?
A large number of tires would be difficult, yes.
Now, can you say, Doctor, that the boiler on the property was the place where the original burning occurred, can you?
That's correct.
And you can't say that the smelter is the place of the original burning, correct?
That is correct.
Now, you had photographs of those items, right?
That's correct.
And you looked at the cellulose ash, which was recovered from the wood burner, and you looked at the cellulose ash which was recovered from the wood burner boiler, right?
Yes.
That ash is entirely inconsistent with the type of ash and debris which was recovered from the pit, correct?
From what I recall, yes.
All right. And in your review of the photographs of the smelter, there was no ash or charring or anything inside the smelter, right?
That's correct.
That you could see.
That I could see, that's correct.
So we certainly can't say that the smelter was the place where the remains were burned, right?
Not to my knowledge, no.
All right. By the way, are you familiar with the process called board certification?
Yes, I am.
And what is that?
It's board certification for forensic anthropologists is the American Board of Forensic Anthropology.
Yeah, you have not yet pursued that certification. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. All right. Oh, one more thing, Doc. You never looked at the bones in this case, did you?
I did not.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Mr. Strang, any redirect?
I do, thank you. Dr. Fairgrieve, you were asked a number of questions about what it is that you had to look at.
Yes.
Or was there anything at all that you asked Mr. Buting or me for that we declined to give you?
Not to my knowledge. I don't recall that there was anything denied that I was asked for.
And anything you thought you needed that you asked us for and we said we had but wouldn't give you, or that we didn't have for that matter?
No, I don't believe so.
Is there any evidence at all that you have seen in all of the photographs you have looked and Dr. Eisenberg's 2 reports or in her testimony that the body you have seen here was dismembered in any way before burning?
Prior to burning, no.
Had tyres, rubber tyre, car tyres, some sort of tyre been used as a fuel to burn this body? Would you have expected a burned rubber residue sort of smell on at least some of the bone fragments?
I have encountered that myself in experimentation.
Is it a pungent or a strong smell?
When you're close to the bones, it can be strong.
And when you say you have encountered that yourself in experimentation,
Yes.
perhaps you can tell us what that is?
Part of the research that I undertake is to do test burns. And we utilize for these purposes pig carcasses or various sizes to mimic human remains. And burning up tires is just one such scenario of consuming the flesh.
And as a fuel?
As a fuel, yes.
Have you done that yourself?
Yes, I have.
And what did you smell with the burnt remains of the pig afterwards?
Quite a pungent odor associated with the remains from the actual smell of the rubber.
Is there any reason at all? No, let me back up because I want to be clear. You are not here to tell us that you can say any particular site is the burn site in this case.
That is correct.
Okay. Neither are you able to rule out or exclude any possible burn sites, if I understood you?
That's correct.
But what you have told us that in your experience, you find the majority of bones usually in the place to which bones are moved, not the place from which they are moved?
Yes, that's accurate.
Including smaller or more delicate bones?
Yes, I have found that to be the case.
In your experience, do you have any reason to think that a dead human body could not be put in a 55-gallon drum or burn barrel?
No, I see no reason why it couldn't.
Do you have any idea at all here, in the end, where clothing fragments, whether that's fabric or metal items or grommets from clothing, were recovered?
From other locations?
Do you have any idea where the police may have found remnants or possible remnants of clothing?
From what I understood, it was from the actual burn barrel, the pit behind Avery garage.
Okay. You don't know whether fragments were found elsewhere?
Not to my knowledge.
Neither do you know whether they were missed elsewhere?
Definitely not.
You spoke of on the average, of the fragments in the burn barrel being larger than, on the average, the fragments in the burn area.
Yes.
Behind the garage. What were the largest fragments you saw of bone there? Behind the garage. What were the largest fragments you saw of bone here, regardless where found?
As I recall, I believe it was the cranial fragments.
And about how big were those?
Oh, I would say it looked like about 1.5 inches in diameter.
Okay.
Something on that order.
So when we're talking about large and small,
Yeah.
as I understand, everything here is about 1.5 inches on down to smaller than that.
From what I recall, yeah.
Is a barrel something in which burnt human remains might be moved and then, turned over or dumped elsewhere?
Oh, sure.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Mr. Fallon, anything else?
About 3 questions. The smell that one might, on occasion, find from human remains subjected to a fire involving rubber, that smell would dissipate over time, right?
It is possible, yes.
As a matter of fact, it would certainly be subject to the elements of weather, would it not?
I agree.
And that would certainly help dissipate the smell.
That's possible, yes.
As a matter of fact, the greater degree of charring and calcination is likelihood that you're going to have that kind of smell because there's not much left to attach to, right?
That is correct.
I lost my train of thought. If I may have one moment. I'm afraid you're lucky, Doc. I lost that train of thought. I'm done.
Mr. Strang, anything else?
No, thanks.
Very well, you're excused. Mr. Strang.
What I would propose to do at the moment is simply to read a stipulation to which both Mr. Avery and the state have agreed, as I understand it.
Is that correct, counsel?
Yes, that's fine, Judge.
All right, you may do so.
Ladies and gentlemen, the parties agree that on October 31st, 2005, Stephen Avery spoke twice with Jodie Stokowski, his girlfriend, on his cordless land telephone line. Each conversation was about...
Just a second, Mr. Strang. I don't think number 7 is working anymore. So you may want to use the...
The trial is over when the electronics die. Do I need to start over?
I think that would be the best.
All right. The stipulation reads as follows. The parties agree that on October 31st, 2005, Stephen Avery spoke twice with Jodie Stokowski, his girlfriend, on his cordless land telephone line. Each conversation was about 15 minutes. The first began at 5:36 p.m. and the second began at 8:57 p.m.
And Mr. Kratz, is the state joining in that stipulation?
It certainly is, Judge.
Very well. We'll receive the stipulation, Mr. Kratz, or Mr. Strang, excuse me.
Next defence witness, briefly, is Investigator Mark Wiegert.
Very well.
Please be seated. Please state your name and spell your last name for the record.
Mark Wiegert, Liegert. Oh, sorry. Mark Wiegert, Wiegert.
Good afternoon again, Mr. Wiegert.
Good afternoon.
I think you probably were here in the courtroom with us when a young woman named Lisa Buchner testified yesterday.
Aye, sir.
Had you interviewed her previously?
Right, I remember the interview very well.
Was that Did the interview take place on Monday, November the 7th, 2005?
It did,
All right. And among other things, did Miss Buckner tell you on Monday, November the 7th, 2005, that she remembered some things on Saturday, November the 5th, and thought it would be important that we would know, we, meaning law enforcement, would know that information?
Yes. She had basically shown up at the checkpoint where we had security up on Highway 147. And I had gotten a call from them stating that there was somebody at the checkpoint that had information. And that it would happen periodically throughout the time we were out there. And in fact, we would get a lot of phone calls about information as well. But what happened is, I didn't have any other detectives to interview because they were all out doing other interviews on leads and things like that. So I told them to let her through the checkpoint. I met her at the command post.
On the 7th?
On the 7th.
Right, okay. And you interview her and she tells you, that she saw a female taking pictures at around 3:30 p.m. one day.
That's correct.
And when you were talking to her on Monday, November 7, she was able to tell you that this observation of a female taking pictures of the van happened either on Monday, October 31st, or Tuesday, November 1st, or maybe Wednesday, November 2nd. Do I understand that correctly?
That's what she told me that day, or she did not know what color the van or anything was.
Right. And she could narrow it down only to one of those 3 days, but it was the week before she was speaking to you on Monday, November 7th.
That's what she had indicated that day. However, she couldn't give me what kind of weather it was that day. Nothing else stood out in her mind that day. She just thought it was between those 3 days. Again, she didn't know what color the van was or anything.
Okay, that's all I had. I just wanted to nail down the time. Thank you.
Mr. Kratz?
Thank you, Judge. Mr. WIEGERT, I'm showing you what's been received as exhibit number 86. When you spoke to Miss Buckner early on in this investigation, was she able to explain or describe for you where this woman was seen taking the photographs?
She had indicated that the time she saw this woman taking photographs was towards the shop area, if you will, at the intersection of Avery Road, where it meets with the driveway. Where you go down to the residence, there's a set of mailboxes there, right in that area.
I'm going to use my laser pointer. Is this the area where Miss Buckner said she saw the person taking those photographs?
That's what she had thought, yes.
Now, when you got to the Avery salvage property on the 5th, that's the first day that you were at the property, when we have seen photographs, but wasn't the van that Ms. Habach was taking pictures of actually down in this area near Mr. Avery's residence?
Yeah, it was still down there, and that's what other witnesses had told us. To that, it was down there.
All right. Last question I have for you, Investigator WIEGERT, at least on this point is, this intersection here, is that the main road or intersection, if you will, for people coming into the business property itself?
Yeah, I think that's actually a town road. I think it's, from my recollection, I think the town upkeeps that road. So it's actually a travelled roadway that leads down to the salvage yard, and that's where people come and go to do the business.
And in fact, I think there is one other exhibit that may show this a little bit better even. Exhibit number 81, that's been received. I will show you and the jurors that intersection. Do you recognize that?
I do, yeah.
In fact, this intersection, which shows actually 2 command post vehicles, I'm pointing to those. Is that where the law enforcement officers set up their command center?
Yeah,
And isn't it, in fact, true, Investigator Wiegert, that this very vehicle I'm pointing to here, a Blazer, as well as a Pontiac Grand Prix behind it, were vehicles that were for sale at the Avery Savage property when you arrived there on the 5th?
yes, and that would make sense. I mean, if you're going to sell a car, you're going to have it up where people are coming and going. Wouldn't make sense to have it down.
That's pretty speculative, Your Honour. I will object.
The court will sustain the objection and order that the last part of the answer be stricken.
That's fine. Let's talk about this Blazer right here, the red and black Blazer. In fact, did you see photographs earlier? That is, that's one of the pictures that Teresa Halbach took. A photograph of that very Blazer that's depicted in Exhibit 81.
That is true, yes. I did see those pictures.
The Grand Prix behind it is another photograph that Ms. Halbach took. That is, the Grand Prix for sale directly behind that Blazer as well. Is that right?
Yes.
And again, both of those vehicles, at least on the 5th, as you got there, were located in the same intersection that Miss Buckner told you she saw some woman out taking pictures of vehicles. Is that your understanding?
That's true, right?
All right. That's all I have for cross-examination, Judge. Thank you.
Any redirect?
So, if Teresa Halbach was taking pictures of a van or some cars up by the shop area that you have described on October 31st, presumably, or November 1st or November 2nd, that's not a photo you could attribute to the call to Auto Trader earlier on October 31st, could you?
I guess. I'm not sure what you're asking.
Well, somebody else would have had to ask her to take a photograph up at this end because that's not where the maroon van was, right?
The maroon van was not up there.
And so if she was taking a picture, she was either doing that on her own or because someone else asked her.
I don't know that anybody had established that. She was taking a picture down there.
Well, if Miss Buckner is correct, that she saw a female photographing a van up at about that end of the driveway.
Miss Buckner didn't say who was taking a picture. She couldn't even give me a description of who it was. She said it was a female.
Right, I understand.
And I didn't know what day it was. So it was between a set of days, she thought.
Did you find any other information that female photographers were out taking pictures of cars near Avery Road or that driveway on any day between October 31st and November 2nd, 2005?
I'm going to object as to characterization, Judge. I don't think you have to be a professional photographer to take a picture.
I'm not suggesting a professional photographer. Do you have any information at all as the case agent or one of the two lead investigators here of any female taking photographs of a van or any other car other than Teresa Halbach on October 31st to November 2nd, 2005, anywhere on that driveway?
Where the picture is there?
Anywhere on Avery Road or that driveway?
The only...
Any information at all?
No, I don't know.
Okay, that's all I have. Thanks.
One other question. But yesterday you heard Miss Buckner say it could have been a week before or 2 weeks before. It wasn't the 31st, even necessarily anywhere around that time frame. You heard that, didn't you?
I did hear her say that yesterday, that's correct.
That's all I've got, Judge.
All right, the witness is excused.
Scheduling at sidebar?
Mr. Strang, any more witnesses today?
No, that's why I was going to approach sidebar. We don't have any more witnesses for today.
All right, I will meet with counsel after we conclude today. Members of the jury, we're going to take a break early today. Before you leave, I have an announcement to read to you at this time. Some of the things that you have heard before. As you know, the court's decision not to sequester the jury during the trial is dependent on the jurors not listening to, watching or reading any news accounts of the case, nor discussing it with anyone, including members of your family or other jurors. For these reasons, it is vital that you do not listen to any conversation about the case, do not read any newspaper or internet reports, or listen to any news reports on the radio or television about the trial. To assure that you are not exposed to any improper media coverage, the court has ordered that, for the duration of a trial, you do not watch the local news on television, do not listen to the local news on radio, and do not read the local newspaper, unless you first have someone remove any articles about the case. In addition, do not visit any internet websites or weblogs which may include any information about the case, or, for that matter, watch any national shows that have any information about the case. The court understands that some of you may be working at places of employment during the weekend. Do not discuss the case with any employees, employers, or patrons. Do not volunteer your status as a juror to anyone. If anyone attempts to discuss the case with you, politely but firmly notify them that you are prohibited from discussing the case. If you are involuntarily exposed to information about the case from any source, take steps to immediately avoid any further exposure. Should you be exposed to any reports or communications from any source concerning the case during the trial, or should you become aware of anything that you believe may affect your ability to serve as a juror, you should not discuss your concerns with any other jurors, but should report any concerns to the jury bailiff. As you know, we're getting close to the end of the trial. It is important for the court to know that each of you has been able to comply with the court's restrictions on outside information about this case. Should any of you believe that you have been exposed to any outside information about the case, such as through the news media or from any other persons, including other family members or jurors, it is important that you report such information to the court. You may do so confidentially in writing. I would like each of you to think about the matter during the weekend. The court may individually question members of a jury before we proceed to the final stages of a trial on Monday, to make sure that no juror has been exposed to any improper outside information about the case. With that, you are excused for today. You may be seated, and counsel, then I will see you in chambers in a few minutes.
Before we go off the record, I just wanted to move Exhibit 501, which is Dr. Fairgrieve's CV.
Any objection?
None.
Exhibit 501 is admitted.